Welcome to the Plateau of Plato channel, your sanctuary for sleep. The Apeiron is a word that most folks today would probably mistake for a fancy new brand of French soap. But 2,500 years ago, a sharp fellow named Anaximander used it to tip the whole bucket of human knowledge upside down. You see, his teacher Thales was a decent man who claimed that everything in this wide world was made of water. That was a fine and soggy theory, but it was just too specific for a universe as messy and complicated as ours. Anaximander took one look at the dry dust and the flickering stars and realized that the primary reality could not be something you can just pour into a jug or stub your toe against. He reckoned that the beginning of all things had to be something entirely different. It had to be everything and nothing at the very same time. It had to be infinite, boundless, and completely without a shape of its own. He called this mysterious soup the Apeiron. Centuries have drifted by since then, and scientific revolutions have come and gone like summer storms. Yet, even now, our modern professors are still scratching their heads over the Big Bang and dark matter. They are still arguing about that very same Apeiron, though they prefer to use much longer and more expensive words for it. This Anaximander was not a scientist in the way we think of one today, but he was the first to understand a great truth. He saw that the real honest truth does not just sit on the surface for every passerby to see. It is hidden right there where words finally run out. And he was the first man to give that hidden place a proper name. If you had found yourself on the waterfront of Miletus in the year 610 BC, the first thing to strike your nose would not have been the scent of salt fish, but a thick aroma of change. Here, amidst the creaking of ropes and the cries of gulls, a silence of an entirely different sort was being born, the silence of a man who had ceased to hear the thunder as the wrath of Zeus and began to listen to the rhythm of nature itself. We are journeying into the noisiest cauldron of the ecumene, where in the shadow of columns there was sprouting that which we call common sense today. Miletus at that time was not at all like the sleepy ruins on the Turkish shore we see now. Back then it was a true navel of the world, a bold and wealthy city on the western coast of Asia Minor where the Aegean Sea gently licked the hulls of hundreds of merchant ships. Imagine 4 great harbors so crowded with triremes and cargo boats that a stray apple would find no room to fall. The air there was as thick as the sheep wool which the Milesians dyed in that purple famous the world over. It smelled of the tar used to caulk the decks, of Egyptian papyrus, of sharp Lydian perfumes, and of the dust stirred up by the sandals of thousands of passers-by. In those days geopolitics resembled a neighbor's tiff over a fence, only instead of a fence there were the borders of empires. From the east, out of Sardis, King Croesus kept an eye on the city, a man whose purse was so stuffed with gold that his very name became a byword for riches. The Lydians were enterprising folk, being the first to think of minting coins, and the Milesian merchants quickly reckoned that the jingle of silver in a pocket was far more reliable than the promises of priests. From the other side of the horizon the young Persian power was already beginning to stretch its limbs, its shadow slowly but surely creeping over the Ionian shores. But in Miletus itself people lived as if the gods of Olympus had gone on an indefinite vacation. In the marketplaces they discussed not only the price of grain or slaves from the Black Sea, but also the latest theatrical novelties. In the year when our hero was just beginning to stand firmly on his feet, dithyrambs were already thundering in Athens and the island cities, while wandering singers carried rumors of new songs by Sappho or the stern laws of Solon through the bathhouses. Culture was as thick as young wine, and every free citizen felt it his duty to hold an opinion on how to rightly build a portico or hitch a chariot. While little Anaximander ran along the waterfront, the mind was not idling in other parts of the world either. In distant India the sages of the Vaisheshika school were already beginning to whisper that the world consists of invisible particles, and in China the old masters were laying the foundation of what would later be called the Way of the Tao. Ideas drifted through the air like dandelion seeds, flying over oceans and mountains on the backs of camel caravans and in the holds of swift ships. Miletus was the primary crossroads where these seeds fell into the most fertile soil. The city lived in a rhythm of perpetual motion. You could stand by the temple of Apollo Delphinios and hear a Phoenician sailor arguing with an Egyptian scribe about whose map of the starry sky was more precise. The Egyptians brought geometry proven by centuries of Nile floods, while the Babylonians supplied tables of eclipses and curious instruments for measuring time. Miletus soaked it all up like a sponge, digested it, and produced something entirely new. Here they did not merely believe in myths, they began to test them for strength. If a storm began, an old fisherman on the pier might habitually mention Poseidon, but a young trader was already looking at the clouds with doubt. He saw how the wind tore the clouds apart and remembered talk in the shaded porticos about how lightning was simply a flash from the collision of air currents, and not a jagged bolt of anger from the heavenly Lord. It was a time of great transition from fairy tale to observation. Miletus in that period resembled a vast open-air laboratory. On the southern slopes of the hills the vineyards ripened, in the workshops the potter's wheels hummed, and in the port taverns plans for new expeditions were forged. It was from this city that ships departed to found colonies in distant and harsh Apollonia on the Euxine Pontus, dragging Hellenic culture to places where previously only wolves and Scythians lived. And these expeditions were led not merely by warriors, but by men who knew how to handle maps and stars. In such an atmosphere it was impossible to grow up as a mere Philistine. The whole way of life in Miletus in the 6th century BC pushed one to ask questions. Why does the sun return to the very same spot every time? Where does life come from if earth and water seem dead? Why do things succeed one another, paying the penalty for injustice according to the order of time? The boy Anaximander absorbed this noise, these smells, and these questions with every gulp of salty sea air. He saw how kingdoms crumble and how new ones rise in their place, how the sea retreats from some shores and devours others. He understood that neither water, nor fire, nor any other element could be the master, because they eternally struggle with one another. There must be something else, something boundless, which stands behind all this bustle and noise of the Milesian markets. But he was yet to grow into this thought, passing through the school of the man who first dared to say that the world has a beginning accessible to the human mind. In those days the upbringing of a youth from a good house resembled the cutting of a precious stone, for he was taught to master the spear, the word, and the musical scale with equal grace. Anaximander, the son of Praxiades, was the perfect material for such refinement, but within this flawless vessel a dangerous curiosity was ripening. We shall peer behind the closed doors of wealthy Milesian houses and beneath the vaults of noisy gymnasiums to see how, amidst luxury and strict discipline, a rebel was born who decided to trade his inheritance for a search for answers that no amount of money can buy. Life in the house of Praxiades flowed measuredly, like thick olive oil trickling from a heavy stone press into a cool amphora. His father belonged to that class which the Greeks called knights, men whose nobility was confirmed not only by ancient scrolls but by the jingle of gold in chests and thoroughbred horses in the stables. Little Anaximander grew up surrounded by walls painted in warm ochre tones, where the floors were laid with smooth sea pebbles brought from the shores of the Aegean Sea. The air in the chambers was always permeated with the scent of cedar resin used to polish expensive furniture and the delicate spirit of fresh barley bread. For a boy of such a lineage the path was marked out in advance, like a deep furrow behind the plow of a sturdy ox. He was to learn how to manage vast estates, understand the intricacies of sea trade that fed all Miletus, and in time take his carved chair in the council of city elders. The mourning in a noble house began long before the sun could touch the tops of the temple of Apollo. First came the soft footsteps of slaves bringing fresh water from deep city wells. While Praxiades, clad in a thin linen chiton, discussed the prospects for the fig harvest or the cost of leasing mountain pastures with his steward, young Anaximander set off for the place where the soul and flesh of any free citizen were forged, the gymnasium. The gymnasium of that time was not merely a place for physical exercise, but a true sanctuary of harmony. Beneath the shady porticos, where it smelled of marble warmed by the sun and tart olive oil, youths spent the better part of their day. Training was severe and did not tolerate laziness. It began with the young men stripping completely, because the very word gymnasium comes from the Greek gymnos, which means naked. It was believed that clothing hides flaws and hinders honest competition. The youths rubbed their skin liberally with oil mixed with fine sand to protect their pores from dust and to make a wrestling grip more difficult. Physical preparation was a matter of state importance. Anaximander learned to run through deep sand that clogged between his toes and pulled his feet down like lead. He was taught to hurl the discus so that it whistled through the air, cutting space in a perfect arc, and to throw the spear while aiming at an imaginary foe. Long jumps were performed with heavy lead weights in hand, called halteres, which had to be jerked backward at the moment of flight to give the body extra momentum. But the queen of the gymnasium was wrestling. In the palestra, on open grounds, Anaximander breathed in a heavy mixture of sweat and dust. There was no room for pity, joints creaked and backs were covered in scrapes. This was preparation for the Olympics, which by then had been held for over 150 years. Every 4 years the world stood still, a sacred truce was declared, and the best of the best went to Olympia to fight for an olive wreath. For a Greek, victory at the games was higher than any wealth, it was a touch of the immortality of the gods. But the chief test for the mind was the musical school. There, sitting on low benches, the youths mastered the art of word and sound until they were hoarse and had calluses on their fingers. In those years there were no textbooks on history or law in our sense, for they were replaced by one single man, the divine Homer. His Iliad and Odyssey were for the Greeks a Bible, a code of honor, and a geography textbook all in one. It was held that if you did not know by heart thousands of lines about the siege of Troy or the wanderings of the cunning king of Ithaca, you could not be called a cultured person. The teacher made Anaximander declaim ancient verses in a chant for hours. And here the youth first encountered the magic of the hexameter. The hexameter is not just a way to put words together, it is the rhythm of the heart itself, it is the sound of the sea surf put down on paper. In every line there were 6 feet, 6 clear beats that resembled the measured stroke of oars on a swift trireme. Imagine the heavy, solemn step of a giant, the first syllable is long like a deep breath, and it is followed by 2 short ones like a quick exhale. The Greeks called this meter dactyl, which translated as finger, for in a finger there is 1 long phalanx and 2 short ones. This rhythm saturated the consciousness of the boy. However, even then he began to wonder, if the gods in Homer are so like humans with their whims and grievances, then who truly governs this grand rhythm of the universe? While Anaximander learned to master body and word, the rest of the world lived its own turbulent and often tragic life. If we could look east toward the sacred lands of the Judeans, we would see times of deep sorrow and great change. At the very time when porticos were being built in Miletus, the great prophets were living out their final years in Jerusalem. This was the era of Jeremiah, a time when the Jewish people stood on the threshold of catastrophe. The Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar was already whetting his swords, and soon the first temple built by Solomon would turn to ash, and the people would be led away into the long Babylonian captivity. There, by the rivers of Babylon, they would mourn their homeland while Anaximander and Miletus would be trying to understand the laws of the heavenly bodies. And if we travel far to the north to the misty shores of that island which we call England today, we find the world frozen in the deep antiquity of the Iron Age. There were no theaters, no gymnasiums, and no hexameter. In the territory of future Britain, people lived in round houses of wood and clay surrounded by harsh forests. They built mighty hill forts to defend against neighbors and worshipped the forces of nature under the shadow of oak groves. While the Greeks calculated the trajectories of stars, Celtic tribes were only beginning to master the secrets of forging iron, creating swords and plows that would change the face of this wild land. For them the world was full of spirits and shadows, and they could not even imagine that somewhere on the warm coast of a southern sea a youth named Anaximander was already seeking a single cause for all that exists. Praxiades, being a man of action, closely followed the progress of his son. He saw that the boy possessed a sharp mind and a keen memory, which are so necessary for conducting business in noisy Miletus. The father took him along to the Agora, the main square of the city, where among the rows of Phoenician glass, painted ceramics, and piles of Scythian furs the fates of entire fortunes were decided. There Anaximander learned to listen not only to what people say, but also to what they keep silent about. He saw how the faces of merchants changed at the news of a strong storm in the open sea or of a new tax introduced by the Lydian king Croesus. These lessons of worldly wisdom were supposed to make him a firm and calculating master. However, inside this prosperous youth lived an entirely different man. While his peers in the gymnasiums boasted of new cloaks made of fine Milesian wool, Anaximander could sit for hours in the inner courtyard of the house and watch as a sunbeam slowly crawled along a smooth marble column. He was interested not in how many silver talents were spent on the construction of this portico, but in why the shadow from it becomes longer toward evening. In the house of Praxiades they often held symposiums where, to the sounds of the aulos and tart wine, noble men discussed the news of great politics. To Anaximander, sitting in the shadow of the columns, came snatches of conversation about how in distant Egypt the pharaohs were erecting temples of such height that they touched the very clouds. These rumors stirred the imagination, turning the world from a set of trade routes into a giant, breathing organism. But while the father saw in these events only a threat to his caravans, the son sought in them a hidden pattern. He felt that behind all this bustle, behind the clinking of coins on the agora, behind the endless repetitions of Homeric verses and the cries of slaves, there lay some great truth. Gradually the cozy walls of the ancestral nest began to seem cramped to the youth. The luxury that surrounded him from birth gave comfort, but it did not give answers to the main questions. What was there before his lineage became noble? What was there before Miletus turned into a master of the sea? What will remain when these majestic marble porticos crumble into white dust under the weight of centuries? These thoughts were extremely dangerous for a future politician, for they distracted from reality. But Anaximander could no longer stop this internal race. He understood that his true inheritance lay not in the copper chests of his father, but in that infinite abyss which opens to everyone who dares to lift their eyes to the stars and ask why they shine by the very same laws every night. Thus among the olive groves and marble halls of Miletus, whose mind had already outgrown the borders of his native city. He did not yet know that soon fate would bring him together with the one who would help him turn these vague guesses into the first scientific picture of the world in human history. But the seed sown by the stern school of the gymnasium, the measured rhythm of Homer, and the awareness of the grandeur of the universe had already given their first, prickly sprouts in the soul of the son of Praxiades. In Miletus of the 6th century BC, it was a parlous business to go about asking questions of old men who had a knack for predicting eclipses, for their answers might well rob a body of sleep for a good many decades. When Anaximander first crossed the threshold of the house of Thales, he was looking for a tutor, but what he found was a mirror wherein infinity itself stood reflected. This is the tale of how two of the brightest minds in all Ionia came together to give the gods their walking papers and permanently discharge them from the business of managing the universe. Imagine that day if you please. The sun sat high in the zenith, baking the flat rooftops of Miletus until they turned white with heat, while down at the docks there was such a hullabaloo that the cries of the gulls were clean drowned out by the polyglot shouting of the sailors. Young Anaximander, whose shoulders still put one in mind of a fresh tan from his exertions in the gymnasium, walked down a narrow street toward the home of a man whose name was whispered in the city with a mixture of caution and genuine awe. Thales by that time was more than just a wiseacre, he was a living legend, the very man who had calculated the exact moment the moon would throw a blanket over the sun and thereby put a stop to a perfectly good war between the Medes and the Lydians. Folks said he was a kinsman to Praxiades, perhaps a cousin or an uncle, which gave the lad the right to step inside without too much knocking of the knees, though his curiosity was powerful enough to sink a ship. Before taking his leave of the paternal roof, Anaximander went to say goodbye to his mother as was the custom of the country. In a grand establishment like the manor of Praxiades, life ran as smooth and regular as the clockwork of the heavenly spheres. There was no room for any unseemly rushing about or low-down toil for the masters. A veritable army of servants, made up of slaves brought in from Thrace or the far corners of the Black Sea, flitted through the hallways like voiceless shadows. The slave women looked after everything from baking the bread to blacking the master's sandals. Not a single soul among the high-born family members ever bothered their heads with the trifles of daily living. It was a slave girl on her bended knees who tugged the leather straps tight on the feet of the young philosopher while he stood there, plumb lost in his own private reflections. The mother of Anaximander was the real prize of that house, a living picture of Ionian luxury. In those times the wealthy ladies of Miletus took as much pains with their looks as the menfolk did with their politics. She appeared before her son in a regular cloud of the finest perfumes from the east. Her garments, fashioned from the softest linen fetched all the way from Egypt, fell in great cascades to the floor in a complicated dance of folds. This rig-out, which they called an Ionian chiton, was held fast at the shoulders by a multitude of gold clasps or fibulae, and cinched at the waist with a belt covered in fancy needlework. Her hair was a flat-out work of art, with long dark tresses curled into tight ringlets, stacked up in tiers and held together by gold nets or headbands bright with enamel. Every time she moved, there was a faint jingling from the bracelets on her wrists and ankles. A woman of that sort was more than just a parlor ornament, she was a boy's first schoolmaster. Until he reached the age of 7, any Greek lad spent his time exclusively in the gymnasium, which was the women's side of the house. It was a private world, shut away from the eyes of outside men. There, amidst the soft cushions and the steady clatter of the looms, Anaximander got his first taste of life's lessons. His mother and the nurses did not pester the children with hard and fast rules, letting them play at ball, roll hoops, or fashion little figures out of wax. It was a season of liberty and fairy tales. Right there, listening to lullabies and old yarns about heroes, the boy learned the hang of harmony in sounds. His mother planted the seeds of what the Greeks called eidos, a sense of shame and honor that was supposed to stay with him all his born days. Her influence in those early years was as broad as the sea, shaping his character in a gentle but steady fashion, giving him a taste for the finer things and a proper respect for the order of business in the world. The house of Thales, where he was heading, did not put on any such loud style as they favored in the family of Praxiades. It did not smell so much of expensive oils as it did of dried herbs, old parchment, and the salt wind that took the liberty of wandering through the open portico whenever it pleased. The master did not receive his guest on some fancy embroidered couch, but at a table cluttered with drawings and copper tools whose purpose Anaximander could not have guessed to save his life. Thales was a man of a broad frame, with eyes that seemed not to look at a person so much as clean through them, straight into the inner workings of the great all. Their first talk was not a bit like the lectures of a sour-faced schoolmaster. Thales did not set the boy to memorizing the sayings of the ancestors. Instead, he led him over to a bowl of water and asked him what he saw. Anaximander started in on the transparency and the shine, calling to mind all those grand words from Homer, but the old man cut him short. He began to spin a yarn about how water was not just something to wet your whistle with, but the very first principle of all things, the arche. To hear Thales tell it, everything in this world came out of the water and would turn back into water in the end. Even the solid earth, according to his notion, floated on a great world ocean like a big wooden platter. As he listened to the teacher, Anaximander fairly bolted down not just the theories, but the tales Thales told of his grand travels. The old man often brought up the years he spent in Egypt, where he learned from the priests how to measure the land after the Nile had come along and washed away all the fences. He talked of the Phoenician coasts, where the sailors knew the secrets of steering by the stars, which to the Greeks then seemed like pure conjure work. Thales described the majesty of the pyramids, whose tops poked right through the sky, and the wisdom of the Babylonian stargazers who had been keeping their notes on clay tablets for hundreds of years. Those stories planted a restless itch in the soul of Anaximander to one day light out for parts unknown, to leave comfortable Miletus behind and go see the world for himself to test his own notions against the facts. For young Anaximander, this was like a bolt of lightning out of a clear sky. For the first time, someone had offered an explanation of the world that did not have a lick to do with the whims of Zeus or the temper of Poseidon. The world stopped being a puppet show where the gods pulled the strings and turned into a massive machine running by its own internal rules. Thales taught him the mathematics he had brought back from the banks of the Nile. Together they measured the height of buildings by their shadows, using simple proportions, and Anaximander was clean amazed at how a dry number could boss around a physical object so easily. They did not do all their schooling indoors either. Many a night they would climb up onto the flat roof when the city had gone quiet and only the sound of the surf put one in mind of life. There, under the great tent of the starry sky, Thales handed down the knowledge of the Babylonian priests to his pupil. They watched the wandering stars, or planets as we call them, and learned to tell them apart from the ones that stayed put. Anaximander learned about the constellation of the Little Bear, by which the Phoenicians found their way home on dark nights, and how the stars could tell you when the seasons were going to shift more accurately than any bird flight or talk from an oracle. In the shade of the portico a circle of like-minded fellows gathered around Thales, which folks would later call the Milesian school. It was not a schoolhouse with desks and a bell, but more of a club for freethinkers united by a hunger for knowing things. Anaximenes was already showing up there, and rumors had it that even a young Pythagoras dropped by during his early travels to soak up the spirit of Ionian freedom. But Anaximander was not just a trained parrot for his teacher. Even as he swallowed every word Thales said, he felt a certain lack in that water theory. If everything is water, then where on earth does fire come from? After all, water and fire are at daggers drawn, and one is bound to finish off the other. How can eternal desert dryness or the heat of the sun be born from dampness? He kept these questions to himself for the time being out of respect for the master, but the seeds of a great doubt were already sprouting in his busy mind. While the two of them were drawing circles in the sand and arguing about the nature of moisture, the rest of the world kept on rolling along its own tracks. In those same years, King Croesus of Lydia, whose legendary bankroll Anaximander had heard of in his father's house, was tightening his grip on power. In the east, the prophet Ezekiel was seeing his grand visions in Babylonian captivity, and in far-off India, the sages were already puzzling over the cycle of rebirth. Miletus, however, remained a little island of pure reason where two men, an old one and a lad, were building the first ladder to the stars made not of myths, but of logic and looking. Anaximander became more than a pupil to Thales, he became his second set of eyes and his mainstay. If Thales was the one who laid the first stone in the foundation of science, then Anaximander was the one who had the brass to ask what that foundation itself was resting on. Their friendship lasted many a year, and it was in that partnership that the boldness of thought was born which allowed a man for the first time to feel not like a slave to nature, but like its curious investigator. Every story the teacher told about Egypt and the towers of Babylon only fanned the fire of knowledge in him, making him dream of the day he would captain his own ships to new shores, carrying the light of Milesian thought with him. The business of preparing to lead the school and write his own book on nature was in full swing. Every night on the roof and every argument on the dusty agora brought Anaximander closer to the moment he would say his own piece, which would be louder and deeper than the word of his great teacher. But for now, he was just a student, taking his notes on the sun and trying to figure out how water turns to steam and steam to clouds, and why this whole carousel never stops, keeping that eternal balance his mother used to remind him of when she was fixing the folds of his very first chiton. To step into the shoes of the first wise man of Greece is a good deal like trying to put on the sandals of a Titan. You are likely either to trip over them and provide the folks at the agora with a hearty laugh, or you must find a way to grow taller than yourself. When Thales retired from the business of being a sage, the eyes of all Miletus turned toward Anaximander, expecting him to be nothing more than a faithful echo of his master. But the son of Praxiades understood that to truly honor the old master, he must not simply repeat his words, but rather pull them down and build upon that spot a structure that could weather any storm of doubt. It was leisure of a particular stripe, a feverish and sporting pursuit of the truth, as if she were the slyest fox in all Ionia and you had the fastest hound in the pack. The Milesian school under the direction of Anaximander turned into something between an elite club for gentlemen, a scientific laboratory, and a gathering of conspirators who had decided that the old yarns about gods flinging lightning bolts in their cups no longer passed for a decent explanation of the universe. For the Greek society of that time, such a school was a positive explosion in the quiet pond of tradition. Imagine a town where for centuries everything was explained by the will of Hera or Poseidon. And then, out of the blue, comes a group of men who declare that everything has a natural cause that can be figured out, measured, and, perish the thought, even predicted. Folks did not go there for a diploma to hang on the wall and throw dust in the eyes of the neighbors during supper. They went there to get their hands on a real power over reality that comes from savvy about its laws. In that shady portico, where the salt breeze of the Aegean Sea wandered between marble columns, there gathered those who suddenly realized that the mind is the sharpest and most dangerous knife that ever fell into a man's hands. And they were dying to see how deep that knife could go into the flesh of nature itself. Anaximander offered them the scarcest commodity on the whole coast, a sense of meaning. In a world where every gale was taken for a whim of the gods, the chance to understand the rhythm of the stars gave a man the feeling that he was no longer a mere chip of wood in the ocean, but a captain who at least understood which way to turn the sails. When Anaximander officially took the teacher's chair, the atmosphere in the school changed in a subtle way, becoming more orderly and strict. If Thales had been a genius of sudden hunches, a sort of free shooter who flung his thoughts like dice to see what would turn up, then Anaximander brought a certain solid system to the proceedings. He understood that wisdom should not be like a secret recipe for apple pie whispered from an old master to a favorite pupil. He decided that the truth must be written down. And right there he made a regular revolution. He took up prose. Before him, everyone who put in a claim to being a sage tried to pack their thoughts into solemn verses. It was reckoned that if a thought did not rhyme, it was not worth a brass farthing. Verses were easier to remember, and they sounded solid, like claps of thunder on Olympus. Anaximander judged differently. He decided that truth is an honest, stern, and direct lady who does not need the corsets of hexameter, the powder of metaphors, or the frills of fancy rhymes. He began to write in plain and clear language, creating the first philosophical treatise in history. It was as radical a move as if someone in the middle of a heroic feast suddenly stood up and started reading a dry ledger or a manual on navigation. Under his hand, everything in the school began to take on the look of the world's first scientific corporation. Youths like the inquisitive Anaximenes sat there now not just listening to rattling good yarns about Egyptian pyramids or Babylonian priests. They studied drawings, worked with geometric shapes, and learned the art of accuracy. Anaximander demanded that words fit together as snugly and reliably as the stones in the wall of a stout fortress. If Thales had taught the Milesians how to wonder at the way the world is put together, then Anaximander taught them the iron discipline of the mind. The very layout of the school in those days was a most curious sight. There were no desks like we have, no chalk and no boards for the teacher to scratch on. It was an open gallery where men in snow-white chitons strolled leisurely back and forth, carrying on endless arguments. Sometimes these debates lasted until the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sea the color of dark wine. A little ways off, taking care not to bother the gentlemen, sat the slave scribes. These fellows were the real invisible engines of progress. They sat with their ears cocked, afraid to miss a single word, so they could catch it right then on papyrus or wax tablets. Without those nameless workers catching every movement of Anaximander's mind, we would know no more about him today than we know about last year's snow. Anaximander became their pilot in this intellectual labyrinth. He did not just feed them ready facts, he gave them a tool, a method. He taught them the great art of doubt. He made them doubt everything that seemed plain as day to their grandfathers and great-grandfathers. He taught them to look through the front of things and hunt for that invisible spring that makes this whole big and complicated world go round. When a man reaches the age of 40, folks in Miletus used to say that he was entering the season of his acme, which is the very highest point of his flowering, when his body still remembers the toughness of a wrestling match in the palestra and his mind has already taken on the sharpness of a razor. For Anaximander, this stretch of time was when he stopped merely looking up at the stars and commenced to dictate his own laws to them. This is a story of the golden age of Milesian thought, when one man in a white chiton was able to push back the borders of the known world without so much as stepping past the threshold of his own porch. You see, 40 years for a respectable Greek of that era was not a bit like our modern midlife crisis, when a substantial gentleman suddenly goes and buys himself the fastest chariot in Ephesus and starts to dye his gray whiskers in a vain attempt to outrun the shadow of his own grandfather. The word acme signified the peak of a mountain that you had been scrambling up for the whole first half of your life. Until 40, you were considered nothing more than a promising youth, even if you were 39 and had 3 children to your name. But as soon as the sun of your life stood still in the zenith of that magical number, society officially allowed that, well, this fellow actually knows what he is talking about now. For Anaximander, this was the moment when he turned from being a talented pupil of the late Thales into the undisputed intellectual autocrat of Miletus. And Miletus itself in those years put one in mind of an overripe fig dripping with sweet juice. Imagine a metropolis that had grown so wealthy on the trade of wool and wine that its citizens began to count their gold not in measly coins, but in talents, which were huge weights that a grown slave could hardly lift. The harbor was packed with ships so tight that the gulls had nowhere to land except on the masts of the triremes that had come in from Taurus or Egypt. Miletus was at its peak, for it had planted dozens of colonies and its goods were known everywhere. However, if you should take a notion to look for a grand stone theater building such as we are used to seeing in Greek cities, you would be disappointed. In the 6th century BC, the theater as a monumental structure did not yet exist in Miletus. Tragedies and comedies were performed right out in the squares or on the grassy slopes of hills where the audience sat on the turf. The famous Milesian theater, whose ruins strike the tourists today, would be built much later, in the age of Hellenism and Roman rule. In the season of his flowering, Anaximander was no mere philosopher mumbling something indistinct about the stars. No, he was the central figure of the polis, its very conscience and its chief advisor. When the rich merchants got into a fix in their business or the city fathers needed to decide where to send a new expedition, they did not go to the priests, whose fortune-telling with the liver of a ram gave an accuracy of about 50-50. Instead, they went to the shady portico to see Anaximander. He possessed the kind of authority that you cannot buy for all the treasures of the Lydian king. People at the agora would step aside when he walked by, and not because they were scared of his guards, but because they were scared of missing a stray bit of wisdom that might fall from his lips. A typical day for Anaximander at the height of his fame looked like a triumphal parade of the mind. The morning began with visits from important personages who wanted to know his opinion on everything from politics to land drainage. Today, tourists traveling to Turkey look in vain for a sign saying that the Milesian school was located here. Sadly, no particular building set aside for philosophers has survived, for they gathered in public porches or private houses. A modern excursion in Miletus is a stroll among the grand ruins of later ages, such as the Great Theatre, the Northern Agora, and the Baths of Faustina. The guides usually lead groups to the place where the sea used to splash, though it is now a marshy plain because of the silt from the Meander River, and they talk of Thales and Anaximander while pointing at the foundations of ancient temples and public buildings under which the stones of that very first philosophical cradle in the world lie buried. And what was going on with the neighbors while our sage was enjoying his acme? Oh, there were passions boiling there fit for the worst kind of novels. Right nearby in Sardis, King Croesus of Lydia was literally bathing in gold. He was so rich that rumor said even his dogs had bowls made of solid electrum. Croesus believed that with money a man could buy anything, including happiness, victory, and even immortality. While Croesus was busy counting his treasures, over in the east in the sands of Persia, Cyrus the Great was already beginning to rise, a man who would soon kick over the whole chessboard of the world. But Miletus, protected by its wealth and the standing of its wise men, slept peacefully for the time being. To Anaximander, Croesus was just a wealthy neighbor with poor taste, and the Persians were a distant thunderstorm that might never roll as far as blessed Ionia. While the eastern despots were busy building themselves tomb pyramids, Anaximander was building a system of the world. That was the heart of his flowering, the feeling that the human mind is equal to the divine in its power of knowing. While in Babylon the priests trembled before the anger of Marduk, Anaximander in Miletus calmly reasoned that the cosmos is a just mechanism where everything returns to its starting point. This period was for him a time of absolute inner freedom. He felt that the world was transparent to his gaze, and that was the highest pleasure allowed to a mortal man. He saw how the light changed on the columns of the wealthy houses and how the shadows moved from the gnomons, and he understood that behind all this bustle stood the great Apeiron. His triumph was quiet, but it covered everything. He did not conquer cities, but he conquered minds. Every word of his that was set down on papyrus became a law for those who hungered for the truth. In the time of his bloom, Anaximander became a living proof that one bright head in the right place and at the right time can mean more for civilization than a whole army of hoplites clad in bronze. And right here, my friends, lies the biggest irony of history. For centuries later, a philosopher would come along who would prove that a man can be both the greatest head and that very same hoplite in bronze at the same time. I am speaking of Socrates. While Anaximander was pushing back the borders of the cosmos, Socrates was pushing back the borders of human endurance. He did not just talk about the good, he took a heavy shield in his hands and walked in the front ranks of the phalanx. This philosopher hoplite went through 3 bloody wars without losing his dignity or his thirst for truth. If you want to see how the mind was tempered in the fire of real battles and why Socrates the soldier was no less great than Socrates the sage, you must certainly watch our video about Socrates on the channel. There we tell in full color how a philosopher who went through war turned the world over not with maps but with questions. Anaximander, meanwhile, stood at the peak of his acme, looking into the future with that calm curiosity that belongs only to the true masters of their fate. He had no inkling that his ideas would outlive the gold of Croesus, the swords of Cyrus, and even great Miletus itself, leaving us nothing but shadows on the stones that tourists study with such diligence today under the hot Turkish sun. You know, there is a curious thing to consider about what the very first map of the world, the prediction of a solar eclipse, and the proof that the earth hangs in the void without leaning on a single blessed thing all have in common. All these notions, which are enough to make the heads of our modern wigged scholars spin like a top, became possible thanks to a solitary stick. Not some magic wand out of a fairy tale, mind you, nor a kingly scepter, nor even the staff of old Hermes himself. It was just a plain, smooth-shaven piece of timber poked into the yielding Milesian dirt. Anaximander was no sorcerer, though his neighbors, watching his goings-on, likely suspected the worst and made a point of giving his house a wide berth whenever the moon was full. He was a philosopher who harbored a tender affection for tools so simple that any village simpleton would have reckoned them beneath his dignity. The most elementary of these was the gnomon. In its essence, it is a vertical pole whose shadow, if a body knows how to look at it, turns into the speaking tongue of the cosmos itself. The gnomon marks the hours, catches the days of the equinoxes by the tail, and points the way to understanding how the gears of the universe truly grind along. You might say, now look here, what is so special about that? Every soul who ever stepped out of doors on a sunny day without treading on his own feet has seen the shadow of a peg. That is true enough. But seeing and understanding are 2 such different things that you could fit the whole Aegean Sea with all its islands and pirates between them. Anaximander did not just gape at the shadow like a loiterer at a traveling circus. He measured it. Day after day, until the soles of his sandals were worn clean through against the stones of his courtyard. Month after month, until the slave scribes began to secretly curse the day this lover of geometry ever bought them. Year after year, until nature herself gave up under this methodical and tedious pestering. It was this very stick that helped him realize things that take a man's breath away, such as the fact that the stars move along strict paths, and that time is not just a moody whim of the gods but a clear and almost bookkeeping rhythm. And it was this stick that let him be the first man who dared to draw a map of the whole known world on a copper plate. If we put it in plain talk, a gnomon is a vertical rod set upon a perfectly level floor. When Helios rolls his golden chariot across the sky, the stick throws a shadow. The length and the heading of this shadow shift depending on how high the sun has poked its nose. That is the whole contraption. No springs, no tricky lenses, and no hydraulics. Just a piece of wood and a piece of the planet underneath it. However, this simplicity is as deceiving as the word of honor from a man selling second-hand mules at the Milesian market. Behind it lies a fundamental science capable of moving mountains. To be fair, Anaximander did not just invent the gnomon out of thin air while sitting in a warm bath. This tool was known in the East long before the first Greek ever learned how to tie his chiton properly. In Egypt, the priests used such sticks to measure the height of the sun and tell the Nile exactly when it was time to overflow the banks. In Babylon, the Chaldean astronomers had been sticking poles into the ground for centuries to keep an eye on the parade of the planets. But there, the gnomon remained a mere slave to practical needs, used for levying taxes, fixing the calendar, or guessing if some god like Marduk was riled up about late payments to the temple treasury. No one before Anaximander had tried to use this splinter to figure out how existence is built in a grand way. And that is where his real genius lay. He brought the idea of the gnomon back from his travels, perhaps having spotted it among the Babylonian sages whose beards were longer than their scrolls. But he was the first Greek to turn the use of this stick into a system. He did not just glance at where the shadow fell, he commenced a regular hunt for it. Writing it down. Comparing it. Finding patterns that until then were considered the sacred and terrible secrets of the Olympians. The gnomon he set up in Miletus stood in his inner courtyard, well away from the kitchen bustle and the chatter of the servants talking about the price of fish. Every day, when the sun reached its highest point, Anaximander went out to it as if he were going on a date with eternity itself. The neighbors, peeping over the fence and seeing the respected son of Praxiades, a rich and honored man, crawling on his knees with a measuring string around a common peg, surely reckoned he had gone soft in the upper story. "The old man has clean lost his wits in his old age," they whispered at the agora. "He stares at shadows and draws signs in the sand. He would do better to fit out another ship for the Black Sea, for that would be of more use to his family." But Anaximander knew the worth of his business. He noticed that on the days of the equinoxes, when light and dark call a temporary truce and the day is equal to the night, the shadow halts at a particular mark. On the days of the solstices, when summer is in full swing or winter is nipping at a man's heels, the shadow behaves differently, shrinking or stretching out like a frightened snake. He taught the gnomon to tell not just the time for dinner, but the changing of the seasons. He became the first real expert on time who could tell the farmers to put away their plows because spring was coming, and he did not hear it from a little bird but saw it on his stick. The gnomon gave him a measure, and in the ancient world, a measure was worth more than Lydian gold. Anaximander was the first to grasp that the cosmos is not a mess, but that it minds numbers and proportions. That the stars and the sun and the moon are not moody actors on a stage, but parts of a massive and stately machine that runs by the clock. And that clock is right there, poking out of the ground under his feet. There are rumors that he set up such a gnomon even in Lacedaemon, which is to say in stern Sparta. Now imagine that picture if you can. Sparta was a town where a man could be stoned for reading a book and sent to muck out stables for saying an extra word. They only cared for the strength of a shield and the length of a spear. But even those iron men, who thought science was a business for soft Ionians, gave Anaximander an ear. Perhaps he wanted to see if a shadow acted the same way at different latitudes, or maybe the Spartans just wanted a tool to tell them exactly when to start a war. His gnomon stood on the banks of the Eurotas among the athletes and on the banks of the Meander among the philosophers. Anaximander, being well along in years, did not mind looking queer one bit. He stood by his stick while the wagons rattled past and the politicians argued about taxes. He became the master of time in a literal way. It was the gnomon that put the bold notion into his head that the earth is not flat like a pancake. He noticed that a shadow in Egypt and a shadow in Miletus at the same hour did not behave the same. Why? Because the surface of the earth is curved. That was a discovery that smashed the old map of the world to flinders. The gnomon let him find north and south with such a precision that the best captain of a trireme would have been jealous. He drew the first map where the world was not a collection of myths but a geometric shape. Of course, his map looked more like a child's sketch than a proper piece of work, but the try was what mattered. A man had finally taken a ruler to the face of the universe. Before Anaximander, folks thought the world was a pile of junk tossed together by the gods in the dark. Anaximander proved with a stick that the world is an order. And that order can be reckoned if a body has the patience and the knack for asking the right questions. He made knowledge something a person could reach out and touch. He showed that to understand the universe, you do not need to be a 10th-generation priest or fall into a trance in a smelly cave. You just need a stick, the sun over your head, and a brain in your skull. Imagine Babylon of the 6th century BC if you please. It is not just a city, it is a huge and heavy beast, smelling of incense and dust, breathing lazily on the banks of the muddy Euphrates. For young and lively Miletus, Babylon was the old world in the most frightening sense of that term. When Anaximander first laid eyes on its walls, those famous double walls of baked brick where two chariots could pass each other without so much as a scrape, he must have felt like a small child wandering into the library of a giant. In Miletus, everything was soaked in the salt wind of freedom and novelty, but here every stone remembered kings whose names had faded from the memory of nations long before the Greeks had even learned to build a decent boat. If you take a notion that the Greeks invented science while sitting on the shore of a blue sea and lazily sucking on an olive pit while waiting for a muse, you are dead wrong. Anaximander was wise enough and, what is more to the point, humble enough to understand that while his ancestors were chasing wild sheep over rocky mountains, folks on the dusty banks of the Euphrates had been neatly recording every movement of every star on damp clay tablets for thousands of years. This is the story of how a bold Ionian went into the very den of the ancient star-gazers, into Babylon, the city of brick and magic, to steal from them not gold, of which there was plenty, but something far more precious, their knack for seeing in the night sky not the temper of moody gods, but the infinite and unshakable mathematics of the universe. The Babylonians were people of order, carried to the absolute. If a Greek saw a comet and started making up a poem about which god was riled up at whom, a Babylonian priest simply took a bone stylus and a wet clay tablet and wrote down that on such and such a day of the month of Nisan, with Marduk in such a position, the tailed star traveled from here to there. And they did this for centuries. For millenniums. They had archives that kept records of lunar eclipses 500 years before the grandfather of Anaximander was even born. Imagine that steady persistence. Generations of men who were born, looked at the sky, wrote down the figures, and died, handing the torch to their sons. It was the first big database in the world, and Anaximander, when he got there, saw that this was the real key to the heavens. When he finally reached the ziggurat of Etemenanke, that legendary Tower of Babel which was actually a huge temple observatory, the quiet of the place must have struck him. On the upper terraces, high above the racket of the markets and the shouting of the water carriers, sat men who did not believe in accidents. For the Chaldeans, the sky was a massive chessboard where the gods played by rules that a body could calculate. Anaximander spent hours in those cool archives that smelled of damp clay. I can see him now, haggling with the priests not over the price of oil, but for the right to peek at the tables of predictions. He likely seemed a funny sort of barbarian to them, with too many questions and eyes that moved too fast. The most amazing thing Anaximander found in those dusty scrolls and tablets was the magic of the number 60. You and I today, in an age of atomic clocks and quantum computers, are still living by the schedule made by those bearded sages in their long skirts. Why are there 60 minutes in an hour? Why are there 60 seconds in a minute? Why is a circle divided into 360 degrees? You might think it is a law of nature, but it is nothing of the sort. It is just because the Babylonians decided it so, for 60 is the handiest number in the world if you have no calculator but only your fingers and some common sense. You see, the Babylonians used a base 12 system along with a base 10. If you look at your hand without the thumb, you will see exactly 12 joints on your 4 fingers. The thumb is right handy for counting them, 1, 2, 3, up to 12. 5 such dozens make exactly 60. That number can be divided by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. It is incredibly limber. Anaximander watched the priests divide the sky into the 12 sectors of the zodiac, and he saw that this was not just religion, but a perfect grid for keeping track of things. The Babylonian calendar was another masterpiece that the Greeks studied hungrily. For a man of Miletus, time just flowed along on its own, from one holiday to the next. The Babylonians had broken time to the harness, shutting it up in lunar cycles. They knew that a year is not just a change of seasons, but a tough mathematical problem where the moon and the sun are always trying to cheat each other. Since a lunar month lasts about 29.5 days, their year of 12 months flatly refused to line up with the solar one. The Babylonians settled the business in a handsome way by just adding a 13th month every few years. Anaximander carried this system home like a great treasure. He saw that if you want to build a map of the world or grasp the layout of the cosmos, you do not need prayers, you need a reliable yardstick for time. Imagine Anaximander sitting in a caravanserai on his way back. Around him the drivers are making a noise and the camels are chewing their cud, while he works by the light of an oil lamp redrawing Babylonian charts. He sees that the number 360 for a circle is not just a figure. It is nearly the number of days in a year. This means that every day the sun moves across the sky exactly one step on that great circular staircase. This discovery gave him an almost divine feeling of being in charge. The world stopped being a dark woods full of ghosts and became a huge, well-lit hall where everything from the tick of a second to the changing of great ages can be measured with a plain gnomon. But there was one thing where Anaximander got the better of his teachers. The Babylonians were slaves to their tables. They looked at the stars to see if the king would fall sick or if a flood was coming. For them, astronomy was a servant to fear. Anaximander committed an act of the highest intellectual piracy. He took the figures from the Chaldeans, but he left them their demons. He said that he did not need to know what an eclipse meant for the barley harvest, he wanted to know why it happened physically. He turned Babylonian fortune-telling into Greek science. That was the moment when the mysticism of Mesopotamia hit the logic of Ionia, and the sparks from that collision are still lighting up our physics books today. In Babylon, he learned the division of the year into 4 clear seasons by the points of the solstices and equinoxes, which he would later catch with his stick in Miletus. He brought back the idea of the zodiac, too. For the Chaldeans it was a belt of fate, but for Anaximander it became the first model of celestial mechanics. He watched the priests draw the orbits of planets in the sand, and in his head the idea for the first map was already being born, a map not just of the earth but of the whole cosmos. He saw that if the sky is a sphere, then the earth inside it must mind the laws of symmetry. While he was copying tables and arguing with bearded sages about the height of the sun, great Babylon was living out its last quiet years. The shadow of the Persian swords of Cyrus the Great was already falling on those fancy gardens and brick towers. The old world was passing away, for it was too heavy and too set in its ways. But the knowledge gathered over centuries did not perish under the hooves of Persian horses only because one inquisitive Greek from Miletus had the sense to write it down, rethink it, and pack it into his travel bag. Anaximander went home a different man. He carried with him not just a gnomon, but a new scale of thinking. He saw that the world is much older and bigger than it looks from the shore of the Milesian harbor. He learned patience from the Babylonians, the understanding that truth does not go to the man who shouts the loudest at the agora, but to the man who watches the shadow of a stick on the sand for years and trusts the figures more than his own eyes. It was a union of Greek boldness and Eastern depth, and it was that hybrid that produced the civilization we are living in now, measuring time with Babylonian seconds and talking about the world with Greek directness. By taming time with a simple vertical stick, Anaximander came to understand something both frightening and beautiful at once. If a shadow can tell of the hour and the minute, it stands to reason it can also tell of the place where you are standing. Time and space turned out to be tied together by an invisible thread that a body can measure with geometry. The sage realized that the world is not just a string of happenings, but a stage for a massive theater which has its own exact borders and shape. And if you have a tool in your hands fit to catch the rhythm of the sun, it means you can also draw the very face of the earth over which that sun makes its eternal journey. In this fashion, time turned into a map. Imagine, if you please, that you live in a world where the dirt under your sandals feels endless and messy, and news from the next town over travels slower than an olive ripens on the branch. Anaximander was the first among the Greeks to see that this muddle could be licked by using plain geometry and a sharp ear. He was no great traveler himself, but he had a rare gift for gathering the lives and routes of other folks into one single picture. His map, carved upon expensive copper, became the first document in history where our common home stopped being a collection of fairy tales and turned into a measurable object. The Greeks called this space the ecumene. That word sounds like an ancient spell to us, but in truth it means nothing more than the inhabited earth. To a person of that day, the ecumene was the only little island of order and life in a boundless ocean of chaos. It was the whole known world that a person could settle, name, and finally draw. You will likely ask where this priceless relic rests now, that very copper plate where the son of Praxiades first scratched the face of the inhabited world. To my deepest regret, time and human fury turned out to be stronger than cold metal. Most likely, the original drawing of the ecumene perished in the flames of a great fire in the year 546 BC. In that year, the troops of the Persian king Cyrus burst into Miletus, and the city which for decades had been the cradle of thought turned into a heap of ash. The precious copper on which the first geography of mankind was recorded was probably just ripped from the wall of the house of Praxiades and melted down into rough arrowheads or heavy breastplates for the warriors of the invader. But before vanishing in the furnace of war, this tablet managed to make a genuine revolution in minds, turning mythical fog into the sharp lines of coastlines. However, knowledge does not burn as easy as papyrus. Though the copper of Anaximander turned to smoke, his drawing kept on living in the copies and the tellings of those who had managed to see it. They say that one of these copies was brought to Sparta decades later by another Milesian named Aristagoras, when he was trying to talk the stern Lacedaemonians into starting a war against the Persians. He showed them a bronze board with carved seas and rivers, and the Spartan kings realized for the first time how big the earth was and how far the lands of the Eastern masters stretched. Later on, the great scholars of old times, such as Eratosthenes and Strabo, painstakingly built back the lines of Anaximander in their books, arguing with them or making them better, but always tipping their hats to his being first. So, from hand to hand, from one treatise to another, the memory of that first copper ecumene reached the libraries of Alexandria, and from there it came down to our own day. To get the hang of how this happened, a person must for a moment go back to Miletus itself. It was no quiet little town for thinking, it was a boiling pot that smelled of salt fish, dear wine, and the sweat of slaves unloading Phoenician boats. The air in the harbor shook with shouts in 10 languages, and the creak of wooden blocks at the shipyards did not hush even during the siesta. At this time in Athens, they were already starting to put on the first tragedies, and in Sparta, the tough warriors were talking over the laws of Lycurgus, but it was right here in Ionia that men first dared to ask the world the question of its true size. Anaximander hardly ever left his home walls, but he knew how to listen like nobody else. He would sit for hours in the harbor taverns where sailors back from Colchis or from beyond the Pillars of Hercules would tell over a jug of watered wine about wild tribes, about currents that carry ships into the unknown, and about stars that shine different over Egypt than over Greece. The sage wrote down their words, compared them, and sifted out the lies. At this very same time, on the other end of the earth in far-off India, the sages of the Vaisheshika school were arguing that the whole world is made of invisible and eternal atoms. But only Anaximander thought to join heaven and earth in one drawing. He took a piece of copper and began to put the shapes of the ecumene upon it. For a Greek of the 6th century BC, this was a flat-out sacrilege. Before Anaximander, only the gods from the heights of Olympus could see a map of the world. Men had to make do with myths. It was reckoned that beyond the horizon lived creatures with the heads of dogs, and the ocean was crawling with monsters. Anaximander pulled off a quiet hero deed, he simply kicked the monsters off his copper plate. He drew a circle and declared that the land was wrapped all around by a ring of ocean. Imagine the shock his neighbors felt. The map of Anaximander was a declaration of independence for the human mind from the will of the gods. But drawing a flat circle of earth was only the start of the road. The sage looked at his copper table and saw in it not just a scheme, but a frozen frame from an endless moving picture of the universe. His ecumene was wrapped by a world ocean, but what wrapped the ocean itself? What held this mass of water and stone from falling into the pit? Here we come to the part where geography turns into pure geometry. Anaximander saw that the earth could not be just a thin leaf floating on the top. It had to have heft, strength, and its own place in the void. To explain how our common home hangs still among the stars without needing props or a foundation, he had to build a model that no one had seen yet. It was time to turn the inhabited earth into a stone drum floating in the center of infinity. To explain how our common home hangs motionless among the stars without needing any props or a foundation, he had to build a model that no one had ever laid eyes on before. He realized that the circle of the earth was merely the footing for something much grander, and his next move would be an attempt to recreate the entire cosmos in a single contraption. If you could have taken a bird's-eye view over the Milesian harbor in the 6th century BC, you would have seen exactly what Anaximander saw in his own mind. Before him lay a perfect circle of dry land, securely locked on all sides within the ring of the great ocean. This circle was not a bit messy. The sage divided it right down the middle with the blue thread of a waterway, creating a mirrored reflection of 2 continents. This was the first try by mankind to boss around wild nature with the strict rules of geometry, turning the chaos of the landscape into a sensible system of coordinates. Now look here, in those days folks looked at maps much the same way we look at recipes for staying young forever. It sounds mighty fine, but nobody has actually seen it, and if they say they have, they are likely stretching the truth. The whole world to an ordinary Greek was like an old attic cluttered with the junk of legends, where past the very next mountain there surely lived people with tails, and the sea ended in a waterfall straight into the maw of some monster or other. And then along comes our Anaximander. He did not go about inventing new monsters, he just took a piece of expensive copper and decided that the good Lord certainly had an A+ in geometry. He drew a perfect circle. Not because he had personally flown around the planet in winged sandals, but because order always looks more respectable than a mess. Inside this circle he set the ecumene, all our inhabited land, and all around it, like a fence around a neighbor's garden, he ran the ring of the great ocean. To the Greeks, this was a slap in the face. How could that be? Just water. And where was the edge of the world, and where were the Atlanteans holding up the sky? But Anaximander just rubbed his hands and kept on scratching at the metal. To keep the world from looking like a shapeless fried egg, he decided to give it a thorough cleaning. He went and split the whole inhabited world exactly in half. From west to east he ran the blue stripe of the Mediterranean Sea, which the Greeks in their proprietary way considered their own private pond. And from the south, right into the heart of this picture, he drove the line of the Nile. The great river of Egypt became for him not just a source of water and crocodiles, but a tool for a draftsman. With that move of his chisel, he hacked the land into two parts, Europe and Asia. And it was just as bold as if your neighbor decided to repaint the common hallway without asking a soul. While he was busy with this cosmic bookkeeping, life in Miletus was going full tilt. In the harbor taverns, they were talking up Croesus, the Lydian king, who was so rich that rumors said he ate off gold and even washed in it. In Athens, the air was thick with arguments over the laws of Solon, and in the theaters, people were starting to see that an actor could be more interesting than a whole chorus of pickled satyrs. But Anaximander did not care a rap for the fuss. He was after symmetry. He believed that if there is a Scythia in the north, there must surely be a Libya in the south, and they had to be balanced, otherwise the world would just tip over like a poorly loaded boat. No one before him had dared to treat the world so familiarly. The sages of the East, over in India, were busy talking about karma and the moving of souls, but our man from Miletus was figuring out exactly where Asia ought to end. It was the first time in history a man looked at the planet not as a gift from the gods that was scary to get lost in, but as a map you could tuck into your pocket. He turned divine awe into dry figures, and to be honest, the gods likely did not care for it one bit. As he finished his drawing, Anaximander saw that he had tidied up the house but clean forgot about the roof. The ecumene was measured, split by the Nile and the Mediterranean, and locked fast by the ring of the ocean. But this perfect circle of land could not just hang in the void for no reason. If there is such a grand harmony of lines on the earth, then there must be something of the sort above it. The sage put down his copper plate, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and looked up at the stars. He saw that now he needed to build not just a map of roads, but the first model of the whole sky to show how this little earthly circle fits into the massive dance of the heavenly spheres. At night in Miletus the sky feels so close that it seems a body could reach out and touch the stars if he only stood on tiptoe. Anaximander did just that, only instead of his hands he used his mind. He was the first to guess that the sky is not some flat lid of a soup pot or the cloak of a god, but a three-dimensional space that wraps around our earth on every side. To prove this to his neighbors, who were still busy offering sacrifices to the moon and telling fortunes by the flight of birds, he rigged up an amazing contraption, a celestial sphere. This was the first globe in history, only folks did not look at it from the outside, but as if they were standing right in the middle, trying to puzzle out the grand mechanics of the starry dance. You see, in those times, to state that the sky is a ball was about as safe as announcing at a meeting of stockholders that money is nothing but chopped up paper. An ordinary fellow from Miletus knew for a fact that up above sat a solid dome where the gods rolled their fiery chariots. But Anaximander was one of those stubborn sorts who would not take the word of Zeus himself for it. He took wood and copper and likely spent a whole fortune on the work of the finest craftsmen to turn his wild idea into a physical object. His celestial globe was a flat-out slap in the face to the common sense of that day. Why do we need a wooden sky when the real one hangs there for free? The neighbors of the sage surely grumbled as they passed by his yard. Today it is easy for us to poke fun at his wooden ball, for everyone has a smartphone in his pocket with a program that labels the constellations in real time. We are used to digital planetariums and complicated models of galaxies where a person can fly through a gas cloud with one click. But if you think on it, any modern program for studying the cosmos, whether it is a fancy system in an observatory or a simple star map in your browser, is a direct kin to that very gadget Anaximander put together in his dusty yard. He was the first to create an interface for the universe. He understood that the human brain needs a model it can see, a kind of virtual reality of the 6th century BC, to even start a talk about infinity. While he was fussing with drawings and sawing out the parts of his instrument, Miletus was getting ready for the grand festivals for Dionysus. The city was humming, wine flowed like a river, and the theaters were already practicing new choruses. Politics did not let a body get bored either. The Persians in the East had stopped being just a scary fairy tale and turned into a real threat that crawled closer to the Greek borders every day. But Anaximander did not care a rap for that. He was busy putting the constellations on his sphere, trying to figure out how this heavenly vault manages to spin and never hop off its axle. At this very same time in Babylon, the priests had already been neatly recording every sneeze of the planet Venus and every eclipse for thousands of years, but they did it for the sake of fortune-telling and magic. Our man from Miletus decided that magic is for those who are too lazy to think. He took the Babylonian figures and turned them into geometry. His sphere did not tell fortunes by the stars, it explained them. It was the first case where a man tried to tuck the whole universe into a wooden frame and see how it is built from the inside. It was just as bold and new as the creation of the first computer simulation of a black hole in our day. Anaximander did not just look at the sky, he built a working copy of it. Imagine the amazement of the young pupils of the Milesian school when they first saw this instrument. Anaximander showed them that the stars are not diamonds on a dome, but something that has its own depth and order. He made them think not in flat pictures, but in volumes. This was the birth of real astronomy, cleaned of priestly spells and the fear of eclipses. If you can build a model of the sky with your own hands, it means the sky is no longer a secret kept only for the gods. In fact, he created the first scientific trainer in history. If today astronauts train in huge pools and on centrifuges to get ready for weightlessness, the pupils of Anaximander trained their minds on his sphere, getting ready for the realization that the world is much bigger than their hometown. When we look at modern astrolabes or complicated mechanical clocks showing the phases of the moon and the positions of the planets, we see only a more fancy version of that same idea. Modern science has gone far ahead, for we know about dark matter and the stretching of space, but the method itself has stayed the same. We build models so as not to go crazy from the scale of the cosmos. Anaximander was the first programmer of reality, who wrote the code for the movement of the stars not in lines of figures, but in the curves of wood and copper. However, having finished his celestial globe and put the stars in perfect order, Anaximander hit a snag that could not be settled with a compass and a ruler. His model worked perfectly, but it was made of wood and copper. And what is the real sky made of? And more importantly, what holds up this whole massive machine? His teacher Thales once taught that everything in the world came from water. But looking at his dry and exact figures, Anaximander felt that good old water was clearly not up to the job here. The world was too complicated, too hot, and too cold all at once to fit into one wet element. It was time to doubt the word of the most respected man in Greece and make the next great refusal. You know, there is an old saying that a body ought not to spit into the well he drinks from. But Anaximander decided to go a step further. He took it into his head to announce to the whole world that the entire universe is not that particular well at all. His teacher Thales, a man held in high regard and surely a wise one, had once hammered it into everybody's skull that water is the beginning of all beginnings. The idea was that everything came out of the damp and to the damp it would return. But Anaximander, watching how a fire handily gobbles up dry wood, caught a suspicion that this watery theory was missing a couple of important planks. Now look here, for a man of Miletus in the 6th century BC, water was just about everything. It fed him, gave him drink, and brought the news on the decks of ships. If you had asked an ordinary harbor lumper what the world was made of, he would have pointed a finger toward the sea without a second thought. Moisture was in the seed that gives life, moisture was in the floods of the Nile that saved folks from starving, and it was even in the sky where the rains come from. Thales simply turned this everyday notion into the first scientific dogma in history. And arguing with it was about as tough as arguing with the fact that the sun gets up in the east. But Anaximander had that sort of troublesome mind that will not let a man just nod his head and go off to drink his wine. He started to unravel the logical string of his teacher and quickly ran into a dead end. If absolutely everything is water, he reasoned, then where did fire come from? For those two elements hate each other just as fiercely as two rival traders at the Milesian market. If water were the sole master of reality, it would have strangled fire right in the cradle. The whole world would have turned into one endless, squelching jelly where there is no room for the heat of the sun or the dryness of the desert. This was a grand moment of intellectual brass. The pupil looked at the gray-haired master and told him his foundation was a bit too soaked through. It puts one in mind of what goes on in modern science today. We believed in the unshakable laws of mechanics for decades, until we peeped into the depths of the atom and found a quantum mess there that does not care a rap for common sense. We hang on to the good old theories of relativity, but when dark matter steps onto the stage, our schoolbooks start to smell suspiciously like scrap paper. Anaximander pulled off the very same trick. He found a fact that would not fit through the narrow neck of Thales' water bottle. While he was painfully picking out the words for his rejection of water, Miletus went on with its usual busy life. In the harbor, they talked over a new batch of slaves from Thrace whose tattoos gave the local women a fright. In the pothouses, men whispered that the Egyptian priests in Memphis were mighty sore at the Greek upstarts who steal their ancient secrets and call it philosophy. Anaximander was far away from these earthly passions. He saw that if we want to find the true start of all things, we have no right to pick just one of the elements. A body cannot say that everything is fire, or everything is air, or everything is water. That would be unfair to the other players in the grand cosmic show. Imagine you are trying to put one man in charge of a whole orchestra, but that man only knows how to play the drum. The music would end pretty quick and turn into a headache. Anaximander realized that the first principle must be something that stands above all the elements. It cannot be hot, nor cold, nor wet, nor dry. It must be an invisible parent that lets its rowdy children fight each other without letting any one of them win for good. This rejection of water was the first step in history toward real abstraction. The sage saw that truth does not lie on the top and you cannot scoop it up in a jug. To move on, he had to go past everything a man can touch. He turned his back on the familiar ground under his feet. If not water, then what? If not something you can feel and see, then where do you hunt for the answer? Having turned away from the teaching of Thales, Anaximander suddenly found himself standing before a hollow and echoing pit. The old world of cozy myths and plain elements fell to dust under his steady gaze. He was like a man who had rubbed out the only known figure in a sum and was now staring at a blank sheet. He needed a new word. He needed a notion that could hold the endless births and deaths of whole galaxies while staying unchanged itself. And in the quiet of his study, among the scrolls and drawings, he found that word. A word that forever scratched man out of the center of the universe and made him look into the eyes of eternity itself. He called it the Apeiron. You know, the theoretical physicists of our own day with their superstrings and dark energies are no slouches, but Anaximander beat them to the turn a good 2,500 years ago. While the rest of Miletus was arguing over which element was the grandest, he simply went and rubbed all the familiar variables out of the equation. He announced that the start of everything is a kind of boundless mush, out of which everything climbs and into which everything returns. Call it the Apeiron if you want to sound like a high-toned Greek, or just the indefinite if you are not inclined to twist your tongue. Now look here, this was a regular information bomb. Imagine a respectable citizen of Miletus who is used to the notion that the world is run by sensible gods with sensible whims. And then along comes the son of Praxiades and declares that at the bottom of everything lies something that has no face, no name, and no end. The Apeiron is not a thing that a body can touch or pour into a jug. It is the very state of infinity itself. It is a vast ocean without shores that is not made of water. It is a power that is older than the gods and that will be around when the last stars have winked out. The logic of Anaximander was as ironclad as a Spartan shield. He reasoned this way: if matter is fetched from something, then that something must not run dry. If the world were made of water or fire, then over millions of years the supply of that element would have played out long ago, like the supply of good wine at a Greek wedding that has gone on too long. Therefore, the first principle must be inexhaustible. Right there, our man from Miletus, more than 2,000 years before any laboratories were thought of, caught a glimpse of the modern law of the conservation of energy. Nothing comes from nowhere and nothing vanishes without a trace, everything just flows out of the Apeiron into the shapes of things and then back again. Today, learned men are wrestling with the idea of a quantum field or a physical vacuum. That is a kind of emptiness that is not really empty at all, but is swarming with invisible energy that can pop out elementary particles at any moment. Anaximander felt this in his very bones while sitting in his courtyard. His Apeiron is that very primary field, the invisible matrix in which galaxies are brewed. It is a frightening and stately concept that makes us humans nothing but tiny splashes in this endless surf of eternity. Try to describe the taste of emptiness or the color of pure space, and that will be your Apeiron. In those times, the Greeks were only just learning how to think in a deep way. In the theaters, they put on plays about heroes fighting fate, and on the streets, they talked about Eastern luxury which seemed endless to the folks of Miletus. Anaximander knew that real infinity looks different. It is not in the gold of King Croesus nor in the number of a man's slaves. It is in that relentless law that makes worlds be born and die in a strict order. To an ordinary fellow, the Apeiron was too cold and uncomfortable. It is much easier to bring a sacrifice to Poseidon and believe the sea will calm down. It is no use praying to the Apeiron, for it has no ears. It is a faceless machine of the universe that knows no pity and makes no exceptions. But it was exactly this lack of human traits that made the philosophy of Anaximander the first real science. He moved God outside the brackets and left there the pure, boundless might of nature. Finishing his thoughts on the indefinite, Anaximander saw that now he had to explain how such different things as ice and flame come out of this smooth, eternal pit. If the Apeiron is one, then why is the world so varied? How does the roar of the struggle of opposites come out of this silence? The sage took up his chisel once more. He was set to describe how heat and cold break away from the embrace of infinity, starting that very great war of the elements that we call life. It was time to look into the very kettle of creation where the conflict that gives start to all existence is born. In our time we are used to formulas and the invisible forces of gravity, but for a Greek of the 6th century BC, the only real thing was what a man could drop on his own foot. Anaximander decided to put a stop to this simple way of looking at things. He rolled out onto the philosophical stage the notion of the Apeiron, a kind of boundless nothing that is actually everything. This was the first jump in history to such a height of abstraction where the ordinary human mind starts to gasp for oxygen and the gods of Olympus look like nothing more than small shopkeepers. Now look here, this was not just a new word, it was a flat-out act of sabotage against common sense. Imagine the amazement of the Milesian traders. They were used to measuring the world in cubits of cloth and sacks of grain. And then their neighbor stands up and declares that the first principle of all existence has no color, no smell, no weight, and no edge. It is boundless, it is ageless, and it laps around all the worlds. In that moment, in dusty Miletus, theoretical science was born. Anaximander was the first in history to see that if you want to explain everything in the world, you cannot just pick one single thing out of that very everything. You have to climb above the world of objects. The degree of abstraction here was simply off the charts for that time. Before Anaximander, even the brightest minds thought in pictures, water, fire, a golden chariot. Our hero performed what modern programmers call moving to the level of metadata. He stopped describing the characters and started describing the very code in which reality is written. The Apeiron is not matter in the usual sense, it is an eternal and inexhaustible spring from which things float out into being and where they return when their time is up. Today physicists are doing exactly the same thing when they talk about the Higgs field or the quantum vacuum. We cannot see these fields, we cannot scoop them into a jar, but we know for certain that without them nothing would exist. Anaximander predicted this state of affairs 2,500 years before the Hadron Collider was ever thought of. He saw that the foundation of reality must be made of something that cannot break, run out, or spoil. The Apeiron knows no death, because it is itself life in its purest and most concentrated form. In those days in Miletus, people were learning to use the first coins. That is a grand abstraction too, for some plain bit of metal with a lion stamped on it suddenly stands in for a dozen sheep or a ton of grain. People were getting used to the idea that a symbol can be more important than the thing itself. Anaximander moved this principle to the whole of creation. He showed that behind the visible mess of the elements stands an invisible law that cannot be bribed or cheated. Of course, selling the idea of a boundless nothing to a crowd waiting for an answer on whether tomorrow's catch of fish will be lucky was no easy job. It is like trying to explain cloud data storage to a person from the 19th century. You talk about terabytes in the air, and he talks about his hay getting wet in the rain. But it did not faze Anaximander. He knew that truth is not obliged to be cozy or easy to grasp at the first go. For him, the Apeiron was a huge reservoir that keeps the balance of the universe. In this shoreless ocean of possibility, work is always humming. It is not a frozen emptiness, but a bubbling kettle where matter is only just getting ready to take shape. The sage understood that if the first principle had any specific trait at all, it would immediately become part of the conflict. But the Apeiron must be a judge who stands above the fight. Finishing his thoughts on the nature of the indefinite, Anaximander realized that the Apeiron does not just hang in the void, it is forever giving birth to a struggle. From this perfect silence, heat and cold, light and dark had to break away somehow. The world cannot stay the same forever. It was time to describe how the first sparks of life tear themselves out of this boundless pit, starting the great war of opposites. It was time to understand why everything must pay its own price in the court of time for the right to exist. The sage understood that if the first principle had even one specific trait, it would immediately become a part of the conflict. But the Apeiron must be a judge who stands above the fight. It was time to describe how the first sparks of life tear themselves out of this boundless pit, starting the great war of opposites. In our time, physicists love to talk about Newton's third law or about matter and antimatter, but Anaximander predicted all of this just by watching his supper cool down. He realized that things come out of the featureless Apeiron only in pairs, like the beasts into Noah's Ark. Hot separates from cold, and dry from moist. And it is this very eternal scrapping between them that turns the flywheel of time. If the elements made peace for even a second, the world would just stop like a clock with a snapped spring. Now look here, this is brilliant in its plainness. Imagine an absolutely quiet room where nothing is going on. To get even a bit of a stir starting in there, you need to create a difference, such as turning on a light in one corner or opening a window to let in a draft. Anaximander was the first to guess that our world arose from exactly such a break in symmetry. From the eternal and motionless Apeiron, something broke away that gives birth to heat and cold. And as soon as those two met, the show began which we are still watching to this day. In fact, the wise man from Miletus felt out that very binary code on which all our computers run today. The whole digital universe is nothing but endless zeros and ones, an eternal yes and no, which in their dance create pictures, sounds, and meanings. For Anaximander, those zeros and ones were the hot and the cold. He saw that if only one element won out, for instance the endless water of his teacher fails, then the world would turn into a frozen block of ice or a stagnant swamp. Life exists only where there is a conflict. Today we call this the law of conservation of momentum or thermodynamic balance, but Anaximander put it in much salter words. For him, it was a real war. Fire seeks to burn everything in its path, and water dreams of drowning and cooling everything down. They hate each other with every molecule of their being. But here is the irony, it is this very hatred that makes the sun shine and the rain fall upon the dirt. If fire finally beat water, the world would burn up in a blink. If water beat fire, there would be eternal dark and cold. You and I live in a tiny gap between these two disasters, on a narrow strip of land where these giants have each other by the throat and neither can quite finish the other off. In those years in Miletus, folks knew exactly what real competition was. Trade wars between the cities boiled no less than the elements. If one trader brought in cheap wool, another immediately rolled out discounts on wine. The market grew only because no one could become an absolute monopolist. Anaximander simply moved this market scuffle to the level of the cosmos. He understood that progress is impossible without a fight. Even our own bodies live only so long as a war of bacteria, cells, and chemical reactions is going on inside. Rest is a privilege for stones, and even those, if a body looks close, are slowly worn away by water. Modern science backs this up, for the universe arose precisely because at one moment there was a little more matter than antimatter. If they had been equal, they would have just cancelled each other out and left nothing but a puff of smoke. Anaximander did not know the word annihilation, but he saw plain enough what happens when you splash water on red-hot coals. He saw that the world holds together in pairs, there is no up without a down, no day without a night, and no man without a woman. Binaries are the skeleton of reality, and struggle is its blood. But this eternal brawl had one queer trait. If the elements just pound each other without any rules, then sooner or later one will get the upper hand, and that is the end of everything. To keep the world going for more than 5 minutes, someone must keep order in this ring. Anaximander realized that this war has a higher law that keeps anyone from getting too strong. It was time to find out how time acts as a stern debt collector, squeezing the dues out of the elements that have played their hand too far. If you had a notion that lawsuits and parking fines were the invention of modern bureaucrats, then you did not know the ancient Greeks very well. Anaximander was the first to guess that our entire universe is one enormous courtroom where time itself sits as the judge. He left us just one single sentence that has flown through the ages like a scorched page from a legal record, and there is more meaning in it than in the whole of a modern criminal code. He declared that things pay a penalty and retribution to each other for their injustice according to the assessment of time. In essence, he announced that your very existence is a temporary loan taken from infinity at a ruinous rate of interest. Now look here, this is the toughest and most honest bit of economics in the history of thought. For Anaximander, the appearance of anything, whether it was a hot sunbeam or a cold drop of rain, was a kind of act of aggression. When one thing is born, it inevitably snatches away the place of something else. A hot summer boldly breaks into the calendar and steals the territory from a cool autumn. That is the very injustice the sage was talking about. But the cosmos does not put up with debtors. Time keeps a sharp eye on the hourglass, and as soon as the lease is up, it presents the bill. Summer is obliged to die to pay back its debt to the cold. This is the great law of Dike, of cosmic justice, which Anaximander moved from the benches of a Greek court straight up to the stars. Today we call this a biological cycle or the circulation of matter in nature, but the core of it has stayed the same. Modern ecology is in its essence that very same penalty which we are starting to pay the planet for using its resources too freely. We have been borrowing from the earth for centuries, reckoning that the loan was interest-free, and now we are surprised when the collectors in the shape of climate changes have started knocking at our doors. Anaximander warned of this back when the smoke from olive wood fires was rising from the chimneys of Miletus. You cannot endlessly break the balance and not expect a counter-lawsuit from the universe. You know, there is a kind of grim comfort in this. Death in the understanding of Anaximander is not a tragedy or a curse from the gods, but just an honest way to close an account in the bank of existence. You do not die into nowhere, you just return a rented coat back to the cloakroom of the Apeiron so that someone else can run out into the street in it. It is the highest form of justice, where even the grandest king and the smallest beetle pay the same price for the right to a brief moment of life. In the courts of Miletus in those days, the sentences were harsh, and Anaximander simply scaled that harshness up to the size of a galaxy. This legal machine works without a hitch. While the elements are suing each other and paying their fines, this whole massive structure keeps on spinning. But if there is a law, and if there is a court, and if there is time, then there must be a main office for this whole business. Somewhere there must be this courtroom around which life is humming. The sage looked at his drawings, at the celestial spheres he had once built, and he saw that in this system of debts there must be a motionless center. It was time to understand why our Earth needs no props at all, but hangs proudly in the very heart of this cosmic tribunal, wrapped in the fiery rings of the stars. The Earth is not a leaf on the water nor a stone on a shelf, it is a drum of stone held fast by the very balance of the powers that surround it. Anaximander saw that if the distance to every side is equal, there is no reason for the world to fall one way or the other. It was the most daring thought of his age, the notion of the world hanging in the void, kept in place by nothing but the sheer perfection of geometry. And around this drum, he saw the great wheels of fire, hidden by mists and peeping through the holes we call the sun and the moon. In our time we are well used to the law of universal gravitation, but Anaximander came up with something even better, the law of universal indifference. While his neighbors were busy guessing on what kind of wet log our dry land was floating or whether the roots of the world tree had started to rot, he simply rubbed all the props out of the equation. He set the earth right in the middle of the universe and declared that it stayed there for the sake of absolute symmetry. This was the first try in history to explain the place of our planet not by magic or the muscle of Atlas, but by pure geometry, the kind that would give any respectable priest of that day a splitting headache. Now look here, this was a regular mental disaster for an ordinary fellow. Imagine your average Greek who knows for a certain fact that if you let go of an amphora, it will fly down and smash to bits. It stands to reason then that the earth, if it is not being held up, ought to be flying off somewhere too. Thales put his money on water, others whispered about the endless routes of mountains going all the way down to Hades. But Anaximander looked at the world like an engineer. He saw that if the universe is infinite and symmetric in every direction, then the object right in the middle has no reason at all to move. Where is it to fall if up and down only exist inside our own heads? For the center of the universe, all ways are the same, and the earth froze in that void simply because it has no good reason to prefer left over right or up over down. In modern cosmology, we call this the isotropy of the universe, the notion that on a big scale the world looks the same in every direction. Anaximander felt out this principle 2,000 years before we ever learned to hurl satellites into orbit. A modern satellite is also in a state of falling that never ends because of the balance of forces. The wise man from Miletus did not yet know about centrifugal force or gravity in the way we do, but his hunch was sharper than any telescope. He saw that balance is the most reliable prop of all. You know, there is a kind of irony in this. We are used to thinking we stand on solid dirt that rests on something even more solid. But Anaximander robbed mankind of that cozy feeling of being safe. He made us realize that we are hanging over a pit. It is like talking a cat into believing the floor is made of air, but you can walk on it anyway because the air is very well behaved. People in the harbor of Miletus likely tapped their temples and asked how it could be that nothing holds us up and why we do not just fall through. But Anaximander only rubbed his hands. To him, geometry was more sacred than any old notions. In those years, Miletus was building up and doing well. Huge temples were going up with massive columns that were meant to hold up heavy roofs. The whole city was a monument to props and foundations. Against that background, the idea that the cosmos itself does not need any columns looked like flat-out madness. Anaximander watched the building sites and saw that man was trying to copy nature in the very place where nature manages things much more handsomely. The world does not need crutches. It holds together on the mathematical calculation of the Apeiron itself. This was the first step toward seeing that space is not just a place where things sit, but a structure that lays down its own rules. The earth turned out to be locked in the center not because it is heavy, but because it is a geometrical necessity. But if the earth is not held by anything and is not falling anywhere, how exactly does it keep that place in the eternal spinning of the heavenly spheres? The sage saw that his theory of balance led to even stranger conclusions. It was time to talk about how our planet manages to float in the void without knowing a bottom or a lid. It was time to look into the eyes of real free floating. In our time, astronauts on the ISS call it microgravity, but Anaximander called it the equilibrium of forces. He was the first to understand that falling is a relative thing. If you have nowhere to fall, you float. He robbed the world of the notion of down, turning the universe into an infinite sphere where the center is the calmest place in a hurricane. This was the birth of the idea of free flight in the void, 2,000 years before people even thought up the word vacuum. Now look here, this was the brassiest caper in the history of ancient thought. Imagine an ordinary citizen of Miletus who knows for a certain fact that if you are not standing on something solid, you will surely drop right down into Hades. Their whole world was built on a hierarchy, the roof rests on the walls on the foundation, and the foundation on good old earth. And then along comes our wise man and declares that the earth itself has no foundation and cannot have one. It is just hung up in the center because an equal nothing is pressing on it from every side. It is as if you saw an acrobat in a circus hanging in the air without any ropes, just because he puffed out his cheeks very evenly. Today we use Lagrange points in space for such tricks, special places where the gravity of different celestial bodies balances each other, letting satellites hang still without spending fuel. Anaximander felt out this cosmic balance without having anything on hand but a stick, sand, and his own stubbornness. He understood that the world is not a building on a foundation, it is a little ball squeezed between invisible jets of a fountain. So long as the pressure of the water is the same from every side, the ball is going nowhere. You know, accepting the absence of a prop was psychologically harder than winning at dice against Hermes himself. It meant admitting that under our feet is a pit. The Greeks in the Milesian gymnasiums were used to the idea that for any movement you need an effort, like an athlete straining his muscles in a jump. But Anaximander saw this strain in the very structure of space. He explained that balance is not the absence of forces, but their perfect scrap in which no one can win. The earth is not falling anywhere simply because it is equally bad or equally good everywhere. In those years in Miletus, people loved to watch tightrope walkers performing in the market square. The watchers held their breath as a man balanced on a thin rope, scared to take an extra step to the side. Anaximander looked at this and understood that our planet is just such a tightrope walker, only there is no rope under it, and it is balancing between all the edges of the universe at once. It was a triumph of human reason over the fear of heights. He turned the terror of falling into admiration for free flight. To most of his fellow citizens, this sounded like a mockery of common sense. How is that, holds on to nothing? Why do the birds not fly off into the void when they sleep then? The wits in the harbor pothouses surely asked. But Anaximander was unshakable. He saw that if we admit to one prop, we will have to look for a prop for it too, and so on forever. That is a road to nowhere. The only way to stop this chain is to admit that the world holds together on the geometry of symmetry. You know, if you spend your whole life building temples, you will eventually start to see columns even where there are none. Anaximander looked at the grand porticos of Miletus so often that he decided our earth is also a part of a giant heavenly architecture. He declared that we live on the top of a colossal stone cylinder. This was the first time in history that the planet was pictured not as a flapjack in a soup bowl, but as a sharply turned part of a cosmic machine. Welcome aboard the biggest drum in the history of the music of the spheres. Now look here, for an engineer of the 6th century BC, the cylinder was the very peak of perfection. In those years, all across the Greek world, building was going on that would take a man's breath away. On the nearby island of Samos, an engineer named Eupolinos did the impossible. He hacked a tunnel more than a kilometer long through Mount Castro to bring water to the city. And this was no ordinary digging in the dirt. Eupolinos ordered 2 gangs of workmen to start boring from 2 different sides of the mountain at the same time. Without GPS, without laser levels, using nothing but geometry and the glints of sunlight on water, those men walked through the dark toward each other. When they met in the very heart of the mountain, the error in their figures was only a few meters. It was a triumph of the mind over raw matter, and Anaximander surely knew of this engineering marvel. It was this very spirit of the age, when mountains stopped being sacred idols and became objects for blueprints, that made Anaximander look at our planet in a different way. He saw that the earth is not a thin skin we crawl upon, but a powerful, three-dimensional body. If Eupolinos can pierce a mountain through and through, it means the world has a reliable, solid flesh. The sage simply took the image of a column drum, which every master understood, and scaled it up to heavenly size. By his reckoning, this earthly drum had strictly set proportions. Its height was exactly 1/3 of its width. You and I live on one of its flat tops, while below us go miles of solid stone, just like the stone the workmen of Eupolinos hammered with their bronze picks. This was the first time in history that the shape of the planet was not made up from a myth, but figured out according to the architectural rule. In ancient times, the proportion of 1:3 was considered the gold standard of steadiness and beauty. The world stopped being a chance island in a sea of chaos and turned into a finely turned object. It is as if you found out you were living not on a derelict raft, but on the top deck of a perfectly made battleship, which has sides, and a bottom, and a huge store of strength. Anaximander saw how they rolled those stone column drums on the building sites, and he simply could not imagine a universe built any less professionally. Of course, such a model immediately brought up questions. If the earth is a cylinder, then why do we not tumble off the edge? Anaximander answered that with a purely Twain-like calm, the world is big, and our legs are short. We only occupy the settled part of the top platform, wrapped in a ring of ocean, and no one has ever reached the edge of this stone giant yet. To him, the earth was not just a place for walking, but a grand engineering work hanging in the void by the law of symmetry. But if we are standing on the top of this motionless stone drum, what is going on over our heads? For the sky does not just hang there, it pulses with fire. The sage looked up from his drawings and at the blinding disk of the sun. He needed to explain where the light and the fury of heavenly heat come from in his strictly geometric world. It was time to figure out why what we take for divine lights are actually just glimpses of the primary flame through holes in giant cosmic hoops. We begin the investigation into the nature of the sun and the moon. But if we are standing on the top of this motionless stone drum, what is going on over our heads? For the sky does not just hang there, it pulses with fire. The sage looked up from his drawings and at the blinding disk of the sun. He needed to explain where the light and the fury of heavenly heat come from in his strictly geometric world. It was time to figure out why what we take for divine lights are actually just glimpses of the primary flame through holes in giant cosmic hoops. You know, if the Greek gods had found out how Anaximander explained the workings of the moon, they surely would have taken away his license to practice philosophy. While everyone else was busy offering sacrifices to Selene, our man from Miletus announced that the moon is a hollow hoop stuffed with fire and wrapped in thick air like an old tire. And the phases of the moon. That was just a shutter on a hole that opens and closes by turns. This turned the sky from a sacred temple into a giant boiler room where something is always smoking, shining, and spinning on a strict schedule. Now look here, this was the boldest technical hunch in history. Imagine a huge hollow wagon wheel, only hundreds of times bigger than our Earth. Inside this wheel a fierce flame is raging, that very primary substance of the Apeiron which longs to break out. But it is locked in a thick shell of condensed, cold air which acts as insulation. And only in one place on this giant hoop is there a small opening, a kind of nozzle or exhaust pipe. What we see in the sky as the blinding disk of the sun or the soft light of the moon is just a jet of fire shooting out of that hole like flame from a blacksmith's forge. Today we know that stars are balls of gas and the moon is a cold lump of rock reflecting light. But think on it, how close Anaximander came to the very core, he saw that heavenly bodies are objects that have an internal build. He turned the universe into a system of rings nested inside one another, spinning around our motionless earthly drum. If you have ever seen a complicated weaving loom or a water mill at work, you will understand the image that stood before the eyes of the sage. The sky is a huge, smoothly working machine where every part does its job to keep the lights on. Of course, such a model brought up a heap of questions from the lovers of myths. If it is all mechanics, then who is throwing wood into these fiery rings? But Anaximander was firm. The Apeiron is infinite, and its energy will last for millions of years of such work. Cosmic wheels do not need stokers, they obey the law of balance. And the most interesting part began when this sharpened machine gave a visible hiccup. People would fall on their knees and wait for the end of the world when the sun suddenly started to go out in broad daylight. But Anaximander only gripped his compass more steadily. He saw that even the great dark of an eclipse is just a temporary glitch in the working of a cosmic shutter. It was time to look right into the mouth of that fiery nozzle and understand how a simple plugging of a hole turns into a soul-chilling eclipse. If you have ever had your kitchen sink stop up at the most inconvenient time, you have a fair notion of how Anaximander felt when he looked at a solar eclipse. While the rest of Miletus was in a lather waiting for a heavenly dragon to finish off the last of the sun, the sage coolly noted that there was a clog in the system. He announced that an eclipse is nothing more than a temporary plugging of the outlet in the fiery wheel. This was the first time in history the end of the world was brought down to the level of a minor glitch in the celestial plumbing. Now look here, this was a regular revolution in the way folks thought. To a Greek of that day, an eclipse was absolute, ironclad proof that Olympus was in a towering rage. The city would go still, trade would stop, and the politicians would start sweating over their old sins. And then Anaximander steps up and says the heavenly flame has gone nowhere at all. It is still raging inside its giant hoop just the same, only the outlet is blocked for a spell by thick layers of that same condensed air the shell of the wheel is made of. It is as if you put your hand over the mouth of a cannon, the powder inside is still dry, the fuse is burning, but you cannot see the spark for a minute. To Anaximander, there was no difference between a total eclipse and the ordinary phases of the moon. He reckoned they were all bits of the same business. The lunar wheel is always spinning, and its little window either turns toward us at an angle or gets partly choked by air masses. When the shutter slams shut tight, we get an eclipse. When it is halfway open, we see a crescent. This turned the sky from a mystical theater of shadows into a strictly settled technical manual. Science for the first time acted like a powerful medicine for the nerves. If you understand how the valve is built, you do not have to be scared of the dark anymore. Of course, Thales, the teacher of our hero, already knew how to predict eclipses using mathematics, but Anaximander went a long way past that. He gave this thing a physical body. He explained that the sun does not die or hide, it just blinks for a while. Imagine the face of an ordinary Milesian trader when the philosopher explains he has wasted his money on a sacrificial ram because the heavenly will just had a small technical hiccup that will pass on its own in a jiffy. In those years, at the shipyards of Miletus, the masters used complicated systems of blocks and weights to launch ships into the water. Anaximander saw how a rope would sometimes snag or a wooden pulley would get stuck. To him, the universe was just such a massive machine where annoying hitches sometimes happen. These hitches were not chaos, they were part of the system. An eclipse became not a punishment for sins, but a physical process that a man could study with a ruler in his hand. It was a victory of the mind over primeval terror, the first step toward a world where thunder is not the anger of Zeus, but just a bang in the atmosphere. But if we have admitted that the sky is a system of wheels with holes, how are we to know the size of this grand build? The sage saw it was not enough just to describe the plumbing, he had to figure out the diameter. He had to prove his model was not just a pretty tale, but a strict mathematical truth. He put away his plumbing metaphors and took up the tool that never tells a lie, geometry. It was time to find out how Anaximander was the first in the world to try and measure the scale of the universe and why the figures in his head added up to the perfect symmetry of the heavenly spheres. We begin to plunge into the geometry of the cosmos. If you have a notion that measuring the distance to the stars can only be done with lasers and satellites, then you are underselling the stubbornness of a Greek with a common ruler. Anaximander decided that the universe was built according to the standards of. In our day, astronomers would clutch their heads finding out that Anaximander put the stars closest to the earth and the sun furthest away. To us, it seems sensible that distant stars should be infinitely far off, but our hero had his own ironclad logic. He reckoned that the more powerful the fire, the bigger the wheel must be so that this fire would not cinder our earthly drum on the very first noon. The sun is the fiercest torch in the system, and that means its orbit must be the grandest. This was the first try in history to figure out a safe distance to a source of cosmic energy. You know, there was something of a military engineer's work in this approach. Just as the Greeks in those years measured the distance to enemy ships at sea using similar triangles and eyesight, so Anaximander applied those methods to the pit above his head. He turned the diameter of our Earth into a standard ruler, a cosmic meter that can measure even what a body cannot reach with his hand. This was the moment theoretical cosmology was born. The universe stopped being high and unreachable, it became calculable. If you know the size of the foundation, you can figure out the height of the dome. In those years in Miletus, people were learning to think in abstractions. The coming of coins taught them that a small gold bit could be equal to a whole herd of bulls. Anaximander moved this principle of equality to all existence. He showed that the sky is not a chance set of lights, but a well-planned city block where every light has its own clearly measured plot. His cosmos was like a huge nested doll, where every next layer is perfectly fitted to the one before by the laws of sacred geometry. Of course, his figures were far from the reality, but the principle itself is what matters. He was the first to see that if the world is sensible, then its sizes cannot be random. Mathematics became for him the language in which the Apeiron talks to man. It was a bold try to peep at the blueprints of the Creator and find there the nines familiar to every schoolboy. The world gained a scale, and man gained the realization of how big his stone drum is compared to the fiery rings of the heavens. But this perfect mathematical model, shining with clean lines, was always being attacked from the inside. It was not enough to figure out the orbits of the stars, one had to understand why this crystal-clear ether is suddenly pulled over with gray clouds, and the silence of the cosmos explodes with the roar of heavenly battles. The sage saw that past geometry lies another element that does not care for rulers and compasses. It was time to come down from the heavenly orbits a bit lower, to where the winds are born, thunder rolls, and lightning stitches the air, proving that meteorology can also get along without the hand of a god. You know, it is a hard thing to keep up a proper awe before a thunderstorm when a body explains to you that lightning is nothing but a bright spark struck by the rubbing of air against a thick cloud. Anaximander unceremoniously showed Zeus the door, taking away his lightnings and handing them over to the care of natural processes. To him, the clouds were like huge bellows in a smithy. As soon as the wind blows a bit harder, the shell bursts with a deafening crack, letting out the blinding light of the flame locked inside. This turned a storm from a divine punishment into a common problem of bad weather that a person can wait out under a roof without wasting money on a peace offering. Now look here, This was a regular slap in the face to all of Olympus. To an ordinary Greek, thunder was the voice of a god warning of coming troubles. But Anaximander looked at the sky with the eyes of a mechanic. He saw how the blacksmiths in Miletus pumped their leather bellows to blow up the fire in the forge. He saw that a cloud is just such a natural reservoir, only filled with fierce, squeezed wind. When the pressure inside gets past bearing, the shell gives way and rips. That terrible sound that makes the mountains shake is just the physical effect of a sudden tear in the cloud. And lightning is a momentary flash of fire that breaks through the crack in the cloud before the air shuts tight again. But where does this wind itself come from? He was the first in the world to offer a remarkably precise explanation. Wind is the movement of air. He saw that air doesn't simply hang above the earth, it moves under the influence of the sun's heat. The sun, that enormous celestial torch, constantly influences the atmosphere, causing air masses to shift from side to side. This was the first attempt in history to describe the mechanics of the movement of the elements. While the priests wondered which god was in a bad mood and blowing into our sails, Anaximander studied how heat sets invisible currents in motion. In those days, the circular movement of water was a complete mystery to people. Rain was considered either a gift or a curse from heaven. But our man from Miletus connected it all. The sun heats the surface of the land and sea, moisture rises as steam, turning into fog and clouds, and then, condensing, falls back. This was the first scientific attempt to explain how the moisture cycle works. The world has ceased to be a toy in the hands of whimsical creatures and has transformed into a system where heat and cold set water in motion according to strict laws. If you understand how steam rises from a pot, you will understand how rain is born over the sea. In this way of looking at things, there was a heap of that very sober logic that robs a storm of its mystical halo. A thunderstorm stopped being a grand drama and became the result of the physical mixing of the elements. Lightning was no longer thought to be an aimed hit at a sinner, it struck where the cloud was thinnest, obeying only the push of the wind. Science acted as a tool to clear the mind of superstitious fear of heavenly noise. But this work of the sun and moisture did not stop at just thunderstorms. The sage noted that the mixing of heat and water brings forth not just storms, but something much more tangled. Looking at the mud warmed by the sunbeams and at the life swarming in the shore slime, he came to the conclusion that life itself was not made from clay by the hands of the gods. He saw that the damp earth under the work of heavenly fire is capable of the greatest marvel, the bringing forth of the first living beings. It was time to talk about how our distant kin came out of the warm moisture and the sun's heat. We begin to plunge into the secret of the start of life as Anaximander pictured it. If you have ever seen how a suspicious, wriggling life starts up in a stagnant puddle after a hot day, then you understand the train of Anaximander's thought. While other philosophers were arguing over exactly what kind of clay Prometheus used to fashion the first man, our man from Miletus simply pointed a finger at the shore slime. He declared that life started all by itself when the sun's heat gave the damp earth a good baking. This was the boldest biological hunch of ancient times. We did not fall from the heavens, we literally came out of the warm dirt. Now look here, this was the most logical kitchen in the history of thought. Anaximander watched the harbor of Miletus every day. He saw how the sun dried up the shores, how the sea pulled back, and how in the shallows, in that hot mix of sand, salt, and mud, myriads of small creatures suddenly started to stir. He reasoned soundly, if heat and damp are enough for life to appear in a puddle, then nothing but the sun and a primary ocean are needed for life to appear on the whole planet. The moist earth under the rays of the heavenly flame became a kind of incubator where matter began to turn into flesh by the law of natural necessity. To the sage, this was a process of evaporation in its pure form. When the sun heats the water, it seeks to turn into air, and what stays behind in the dregs, that very warm, bubbling moisture, becomes the cradle for the first organisms. This turned nature from a backdrop for the deeds of heroes into a huge autonomous process. Miletus in those years was doing well on account of the riches of the sea, and Anaximander simply moved his experience of watching the shoreline to the scale of the whole history of the earth. If the mud brings forth worms and insects under his feet, then it stands to reason it once brought forth everything else too. However, it is worth making an important pause and admitting that for all the genius of this hunch, it has remained a theory thrown into eternity. Anaximander believed in the spontaneous start of life, but in more than 2,000 years, mankind has never been able to confirm this process by trial. Even in the most advanced modern laboratories, fitted out with the latest gear, learned men have never once managed to create a case where something truly alive suddenly jumped out of absolutely dead matter, out of an ordinary chemical soup in sunlight. We have learned to split the atom and peep into other galaxies, but the secret of that very first spark in the shore slime of Miletus still stays under 7 seals. Not one single powerful laser and not one supercomputer model has been able to repeat the trick of Anaximander with the turning of mud into life. The sage offered us a handsome, tidy logical model, but nature keeps on holding on to that secret, refusing to play out the scene of spontaneous birth for an encore before the eyes of modern searchers. But despite the lack of laboratory proof, Anaximander was sure he was right. His logic called for a follow-up. If life arose in that warm water and soaked up the energy of the sun, it could not just sit in the slime forever. He needed to understand how those first damp forms of life grew further and exactly who they were to us. The sage looked closely at the dwellers of the sea and noted one important bit. He came to the conclusion that our direct kin were real masters of the deeps before they set out on their most desperate act. It was time to find out why Anaximander reckoned that mankind came out of a fish, and exactly what kind of sea container delivered us to the shore of this planet. In the 6th century BC, to say that man came from a fish was just as risky as it would be today to declare that the earth is actually shaped like a suitcase. But Anaximander was as steady as a rock. He noticed a striking likeness between the dwellers of the deep and the beginnings of life and built up a theory of the transformation of species. To him, a fish was not just supper, but a temporary shelter, a kind of biological container that allowed life to move from the damp slime onto the solid dirt. Now look here, this was a brilliant engineering scheme. Imagine that life in the primary ocean was too tender to just up and walk out under the scorching rays of the sun. It needed a package, a reliable diving suit. Anaximander guessed that the first humans developed inside creatures very much like fish, but covered in a prickly, hard scale that put a body in mind of tree bark. This armor was a life and death matter. It held the moisture inside and kept the sun's heat from turning the future human into a dried herring before his time. The sage saw in this process a deep logic of survival. While the world around was drying out and the dry land was forming, mankind waited inside its scaly guardians. When the right moment came and the creatures grew strong, this prickly shell simply burst like an overripe fruit. Those who were inside stepped onto the shore already able to breathe the air and find their own food. This was the first try in history to describe an evolutionary jump not as a miracle, but as a timely change of equipment. We are fish that simply changed our wardrobe at the proper moment. You know, in this way of looking at things, there was a heap of observations of dolphins and sharks, which the sailors in the harbor of Miletus saw in plenty. Anaximander noted that some sea dwellers look surprisingly like humans in their inner build or their ways. He decided that nature does not make sudden moves, she flows smoothly from one shape into another. The fish became for him that very missing link without which our stepping onto the shore would have been technically impossible. This turned the ocean into a giant incubator where life carefully sharpened its tools before claiming its rights to the beach. Of course, to his neighbors, such a family tree looked a bit fishy. It is much more pleasant to reckon yourself a child of Zeus than akin to a prickly shark. But Anaximander stood his ground. Nature is one, and the laws by which the grass grows or the tuna swims apply to man as well. We are not a landing party from the heavens, we are the result of a long and damp sea watch. Our skin, our breathing, and our very existence are an echo of those times when we hid behind a reliable layer of scales. However, in all this handsome theory of transformation, there was one huge hole that the sage could not overlook. If we came out of the fish so strong and ready for life, then why is a human baby today the most helpless creature in the world? Why does a lion cub start walking almost at once, while a human needs nursing for years? Anaximander saw that this puzzle was the main key to the riddle of our past. It was time to figure out why our weakness became for the philosopher the best proof that we could not have appeared on the earth in human shape from the very start. In our time, psychologists call this the fourth trimester, but for Anaximander, it was a stubborn piece of evidence in the case for evolution. He built up a flawless logical chain. A human being does not survive without a long spell of nursing, which means the first humans could not have appeared on the dry land already able to fend for themselves. They needed time to ripen while being hidden from hunters and the scorching sun. So the idea was born that nature first packed us into other creatures until we were stout enough for our first lonely stroll along the beach. Now look here, this was pure mathematics of survival. Anaximander watched the farm animals in Miletus and saw that a colt or a lamb is able to follow the herd only a couple of hours after birth. And a human at that age is not even able to shoo a fly off his own nose. The sage saw that if the first member of our race had cropped up on the earth in his current infant state, the history of mankind would have ended before it ever got a fair start. We would have been simply wiped off the face of the dirt by the first gusts of wind or the hungry looks of the gulls. From this look at things, a revolutionary conclusion followed: our kind must have spent its childhood in some other shape. Anaximander guessed that the first humans developed inside their fish-like ancestors until a time of partial ripeness came along. The ocean and the scaly shell served as that very protective wall which stood in for parental care in the early stages. We were in a waiting mode while our bones grew hard and our lungs got ready to draw in the air. Only when we reached the power to find our own food did we break through the shell and step into the light. You know, in this notion, there was a deep irony hidden away. Our current weakness is a scar left over from those times when we did not have to hurry with our growing up. Anaximander was the first to note that man is a very particular creature, needing special conditions for a start. And since nature did not fit us out with claws and the power to run from day one, it means she provided us with temporary lodging in the bellies of sea giants. This turned our biological weakness into the strongest argument for the fact that we are the product of a long and tangled transformation, and not a sudden appearance. We have learned to split the atom and peep into other galaxies, but the secret of that very first spark in the shore slime of Miletus still stays under 7 seals. Not one single powerful laser and not one supercomputer model has been able to repeat the trick of Anaximander with the turning of mud into life. The sage offered us a handsome, tidy logical model, but nature keeps on holding on to that secret, refusing to play out the scene of spontaneous birth for an encore before the eyes of modern searchers. But despite the lack of laboratory proof, Anaximander was sure he was right. His logic called for a follow-up. If life arose in that warm water and soaked up the energy of the sun, it could not just sit in the slime forever. He needed to understand how those first damp forms of life grew further and exactly who they were to us. The sage looked closely at the dwellers of the sea and noted one important bit. He came to the conclusion that our direct kin were real masters of the deeps before they set out on their most desperate act. It was time to find out why Anaximander reckoned that mankind came out of a fish, and exactly what kind of sea container delivered us to the shore of this planet. In our time, we look for exoplanets through powerful telescopes, but Anaximander had enough with the power of imagination and the laws of symmetry. He reasoned logically: if our world arose from the Apeiron, it means that same process can repeat itself anywhere and anytime. He was the first to bring in the idea that the universe is not a static picture, but an eternal assembly line for the making of inhabited worlds. This turned the cosmos from a cozy home into a bubbling ocean where worlds are born in whole packs, live out their history, and return back into the pit, making room for new ones. Now look here, this was the grandest inventory in history. Anaximander understood that the Apeiron is by definition inexhaustible. If you have an infinite supply of clay, you are not going to fashion one single pot from it and rest content with that. The sage reckoned that in the boundless void there exists at the same time a countless number of worlds. Some of them are only beginning to cool, others are in their full prime, and still others are already growing senile and falling to bits, returning their elements back into the common kettle of the first principle. This was a notion of worlds succeeding one another like the seasons, only on the scale of eternity. To the man from Miletus, this was not empty fancy. He saw in this a highest justice. A world is born, separating itself from the Apeiron, completes its cycle, and passes away, paying the penalty for the injustice of its separate existence. It is as if you borrowed a piece of matter from eternity, built a planet with oceans and fish out of it, and then, when the lease ran out, returned everything down to the last drop back. Everything in the universe is subject to this strict rhythm of flood and ebb. We are not the center of the world, we are just one of the lucky batches in the great cosmic factory which is living out its noon right now. You know, in this approach there was something of the spirit of grand, trading Miletus. The city was the center of a huge network of colonies scattered all across the Mediterranean. The folks of Miletus knew that past the horizon there are hundreds of other cities where the same kind of people live, build the same kind of temples, and trade the same kind of goods. Anaximander simply scaled this experience of colonization up to the whole of creation. If the Greeks can found new cities on wild shores, then why cannot the Apeiron found new worlds in the bottomless void? The universe became for him an endless network of cosmic colonies, each of which has its own fate and its own shelf life. This idea robbed mankind of its exclusiveness, but in return it gave a feeling of belonging to something truly grand. We stopped being a chance whim of the gods on a derelict island. We became part of an eternal process that never began and will never end. Everything we see around us is but a momentary frame in an endless movie reel of the births and deaths of whole universes. But Anaximander would not be a true Greek if he limited himself to only musings on distant worlds and fish in the primary slime. A sage who has learned the laws of the cosmos inevitably had to apply them to the earthly bustle. For if the stars move by strict rules, then the people in the city should live not as they please, but by a fair blueprint. It is time to leave the heavenly spheres and see how our philosopher came down from the heights of the Apeiron straight onto the square of Miletus to put order in human affairs. It was time to find out how Anaximander became a politician, a diplomat, and a founder of colonies. If you have a notion that an ancient philosopher is just a bearded dreamer who does nothing but trip over rocks while staring at the sky, then you plainly do not know Anaximander. Our hero was a man of action. When Miletus grew too tight in its own skin, he did not sit around writing poems about being lonely, he headed up an expedition and founded a new colony. He understood that the geometry of the cosmos is a fine thing, but the geometry of city blocks and the parceling out of land in Apollonia is what feeds people and makes a city great. Shutterstock. Now look here, the status of an oikist, which is to say the official founder of a city, was in those days something close to being a demigod. It was a job for a man with iron nerves and a reputation that could not be stained. Imagine hundreds of adventurers, poor folks, and the younger sons of rich families crowding onto narrow ships with nothing but the hope of getting rich on a strange shore. They needed a leader they could trust more than their own hunches. And the people of Miletus picked Anaximander. They saw that a man who could draw a map of the whole world and figure out the orbit of the sun surely would not get lost in the Black Sea and could properly lay out the central square of a future town. Anaximander led his people to the shores of what is now Bulgaria, where he laid the stones of Apollonia Pontica. For him, building a city was a continuation of his cosmology. Just as the Apeiron sets apart different elements to create a balanced world, so the sage set apart from the crowd of settlers the future guards, the craftsmen, and the farmers. He personally saw to it that the streets were straight and the temples stood in spots of perfect symmetry. To him, there was no difference between the order in the heavenly spheres and the order in the sewers of a new city. Justice, which he called by the word dike, had to soak through everything, from the weight of bread in the market to the legal rulings in the assembly. In those years, Miletus was bubbling with political heat. The city was always being torn between tyranny and the new idea of democracy. Anaximander had to steer between the greed of rich merchants and the cries of the common folk. But he had one card to play that the common talkers did not have, his standing as a man of learning. It is a hard thing to argue about taxes or the bounds of pastures with a man who set up a sundial in the middle of the city for all to see and prove that time obeys the laws of nature and not the whims of those in power. His political advice was valued because it was free of personal gain. He looked at the city as a part of the great Apeiron, where everything must return to a balance. They say it was Anaximander who helped settle a long scrap with the kingdom of Lydia, using not the edge of a sword, but the power of talk and exact figures. He was a new kind of diplomat who leaned on logic and the knowledge of geography. When others were for praying to the gods for a win, he would roll out his map and show exactly where the trade roads went and why peace was a better bargain than war for both sides. He turned politics from a bloody brawl into a game of wits where the one who best understands how reality is put together comes out on top. He spent long years in labor, making not just laws for new colonies, but the foundation for what we call civil society today. Anaximander believed that man is by nature a political creature exactly because he is a part of a sensible cosmos. His work in Apollonia became a living monument to his philosophy. Even centuries later, the people of that city honored him as their founding father, the man who gave them not just walls, but the very idea of an ordered and fair life among the chaos of barbarian shores. However, for all the state business, the marches, and the building of cities, Anaximander felt his main fight was still ahead. His thoughts, his findings, and his bold theories on where everything comes from were still living only in talk and rough notes. He knew that the memory of men is short and colonies can fall under the hits of enemies. He needed something that would last longer than the stone walls of Apollonia. He decided to do what no sage before him had done, to fix the whole sum of his knowledge on papyrus. It was time to find out how Anaximander made the first philosophy book in history and why that event changed forever the way mankind hands down its wisdom. You know, before Anaximander, wisdom was a lot like a piece of gossip. Everyone passed it on as best they could, adding a couple of gods and a helping of miracles of their own. But our man from Miletus decided it was time to put some order into this muddle of information. He created the first manual for the universe in history. His treatise on nature was written not in verse to tickle the ears at banquets, but in thick, businesslike prose. He was the first to see that if you want to explain the build of the Apeiron, you do not need rhymes, you need facts fixed in black and white. Now look here, this was a real technical revolution. In those days, serious folk spoke only in hexameters, like Homer or Hesiod. It was thought that only poetry was worthy of eternity. But Anaximander reasoned otherwise. Poetry is too foggy and shifty for describing the physics of clouds or the diameters of heavenly wheels. He was the first to bring into use the dry, honest tongue of science. He wrote as if he were drawing up a report for the city council of Miletus, only the subject of his report was the whole of creation. This was an act of unbelievable trust in the human mind. The sage reckoned that the truth is convincing enough on its own and does not need a gold wrapping of metaphors and jingles. We know for a certain fact that his book was a real treasure of the ancient world. Even in the 2nd century BC, when the great library of Alexandria was the center of all world thought, scholars and book collectors could quietly take the scroll of Anaximander off the shelf and study it. There, among millions of volumes, the work on nature stood like the first stone in the foundation of the building of Western science. But time and fires are heartless to papyrus. From this grand work, which described the birth of worlds, the coming of life from mud, and the build of the star wheels, only one single fragment has reached our day. One short sentence that the philosopher Simplicius would later quote. That sentence sounds like an echo from the pit of the Apeiron. Things return to where they arose, paying each other a penalty and retribution for their injustice according to the order of time. In those few words is packed his whole philosophy of cycles, the law of the conservation of energy, and the understanding that in the world nothing is by chance. Just one paragraph, saved from the shipwreck of the ages, lets us see what a powerful mind stood behind that text. We have lost the blueprints of his heavenly spheres and the detailed descriptions of the fishy ancestors, but this single splinter lets us imagine the scale of the whole ship. But do not think that Anaximander's choice for dry prose was a final sentence for all future science. On the contrary, he only set a starting point in the great scrap over exactly how the truth should sound. If our engineer from Miletus believed in the power of the blueprint and the fact, then another giant of thought, Parmenides of Elea, made an unbelievable move in the opposite direction. His main work, which he symbolically named the same, On Nature, Parmenides packed into a grand poem written in flawless hexameter. Here lies the most gripping parallel. Two great minds named their books the same, but chose poles apart tools. Anaximander wanted to be exact and clear for practical men, while Parmenides aimed to be heard by eternity itself. For him, poetry was that very cultural code that turned physics into a divine revelation, making the truth sound like a sacred hymn. It was a battle of styles, the prosaic logos of Miletus against the poetic prophecy of Elea. And if you are interested to see how one and the same name on nature hides two totally different universes, then the series on Parmenides is already waiting for you on the channel. Move to the next episode right now to hear how science gains the voice of a goddess. Anaximander spent years setting his thoughts properly in the columns of papyrus. He fought with the flaws of language, inventing new terms where the old words about gods were not enough. His treatise was the first case where a man tried to grasp the ungraspable and fix it in a logical string. Thanks to him, philosophy stopped being a set of puzzling sayings and became a system that can be studied, added to, and even criticized. He gave us not just a book, he gave us the very chance of a scientific talk across the centuries. But even if that scroll had burned to the last fiber back in ancient times, the work of Anaximander was already done. He started a process that could not be stopped. His ideas took root in the minds of pupils, his maps became the base for future travels, and his Apeiron was the first step toward understanding infinity. It is time to sum up the life of this amazing man who tamed time, measured the sky, and first dared to write down the truth about the world without any trimmings. Anaximander lived a long and full life, seeing his maps help sailors in far-off voyages and his colony in Apollonia grow strong on the harsh shores of the Pontus. He understood the mechanics of aging better than anyone else. If the world is a system of constant exchange of energy and matter, then death is just the final settlement of the accounts. When his time came to go, he did it with the same deep calm with which he had watched the sun set over the Aegean Sea for decades. To him, this was not a personal tragedy, it was the triumphant closing of his own theory on the eternal circle of matter. Now look here, this was not just the death of a man, it was a fixed point in history. The famous scholar Apollodorus of Athens would later write in his chronicles that the earthly path of the great Milesian ended exactly in the second year of the 58th Olympiad. In those days, the Greeks did not have a single calendar with the dates we are used to, so time was measured in the 4-year cycles of the great contests in Olympia. Every Olympiad was to them like a huge pulse beat of the whole civilization, and Anaximander left this world at the age of exactly 64 years, right in the middle of one of those cycles. The system of counting by Olympiads was for the Greeks a way to turn the chaos of local calendars into a common history. Every 4 years, athletes from all over the Hellenic world gathered together, and those gaps became a reliable ruler by which the sages measured the fates of states and the lives of great men. Anaximander went away just when his home city of Miletus was still at the peak of its power. He managed to pay his penalty to the infinite Apeiron in full accord with that very order of time he wrote about in his book. The moment came when the lease on the body had to be closed, and the sage returned to that bottomless treasury from which once came the stars and the clouds. Miletus in the year of his death still shone like a pearl of the Ionian coast. The sage left the city in the zenith of its glory, not seeing those terrible fires and ruin that the coming Persian invasion would bring. On his sundial, the shadow kept up its eternal run, putting the citizens in mind that time is not a whim of the gods, but a strict measure of the motion of the cosmos. His political advice was heard for a long time in the assembly, and his map of the world became a handbook for everyone who risked going past the home harbor. His death in the second year of the 58th Olympiad was the final chord of the first great symphony of Milesian thought. By his side stayed his pupils, and first of all Anaximenes, who took up the relay. Anaximander prepared the soil on which science could grow further. He did not call for blind faith in his words, he called for the keeping up of the search. And though those who followed him would later start to argue with him, putting air or other elements in place of the Apeiron, the very method of critical study would stay unchanged. The teacher gave them the right to doubt and the right to seek the truth in physical causes and not in temple legends. This was his most valued legacy, which fears neither wars nor time. The body of the philosopher returned to the earth of Miletus, becoming a part of that very damp soil from which life once arose. But his stone drum of the earth, his fiery wheels of the stars, and his bold dream of a plurality of worlds lived on in the scrolls and the minds. Anaximander did the impossible, he made the world understandable. He turned a scaring pit into a tidy architectural system. The sage vanished, returning to infinity at the end of his 64th year, but the horizon of human knowledge moved back to a height never reached before because of him. We have walked a long road with him from the primary chaos to political talks and Olympic chronicles. Now, when the shadow of the great Milesian has finally mixed with the boundless Apeiron, it only stays for us to look back and see who he really was to us. The time for the final chord has come. It is time to sum up and realize how one man, armed only with logic and a compass, was able to change the track of the whole human civilization forever. You know, the greatest work of Anaximander lies in the fact that today we take his ideas as something that goes without saying. We are not surprised that the earth hangs free in the void, held only by a balance of forces, or that rain is evaporated water returned to the dirt. This is the highest form of success for a man of learning, when your wildest and boldest theories become common horse sense for every schoolboy. The sage from Miletus gave us a world where a body can ask questions and get physical answers without being scared of a sudden lightning bolt from Zeus. He made the universe clear, and we still look at it through his eyes. Now look here, it was he who first wiped the bounds of the gods' lands off the map of the world and put in their place the real shapes of the continents and the seas. His gnomon in the middle of Miletus did not just cast a shadow, it cut away superstitions from the facts, teaching folks to trust geometry more than the reading of the insides of sacrificial beasts. Anaximander taught us that infinity is not a scaring dark, but an inexhaustible spring of chances, that very Apeiron which forever brings forth the new and takes back the old. His belief that everything in the world obeys a single law of justice and time laid the foundation for all our physics, from the saving of energy to the theory of relativity. Even those hunches of his which looked like strange fancies to his neighbors, like the coming of man from fish-like creatures, turned out 2,000 years later to be fundamental truths of biology. He was the first to risk saying that life has its own history and man is no exception to the rules of nature. His legacy is not the ruins of Apollonia or a handful of quotes from burned libraries. His legacy is our very right to doubt, to measure, and to build models. We are all a bit Milesian today when we try to find the logic in the moving of the clouds or in the build of far-off galaxies. Anaximander gave us the cosmos in the true meaning of that word, as an ordered, beautiful, and knowable system. He led mankind out of the nursery of myths and flung open the doors to infinity before us. And though his papyri crumbled to dust and his name sometimes sinks into the shadow of later philosophers, it was he who laid that first stone on which the whole building of our civilization stands. We keep up his path every time we choose proof instead of faith and calculation instead of fear. The keeper of the Plateau of Plato is already putting out the lanterns and the lamps. The story of Anaximander is finished, but the cosmos he opened to us is still just as grand and full of secrets. Come to the Plateau of Plato again. New biographies of philosophers every week. Subscribe so as not to miss them. Good night.